Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for MassMedic's Supply Chain and Manufacturing Summit. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for MassMedic. If you're not familiar with us, we're a membership-based trade association for the medical device industry that works to bolster our ecosystem in New England through connection, education, events like this, awareness, and advocacy. We have a great program for you today, chock full of timely information on supply chain dynamics facing the medtech industry today and what to consider in the year ahead. Our first session, which will run roughly until about 2 p.m. Eastern Time, will cover the state of supply chain today through a discussion of a comprehensive report created by interviewing operational leaders in the industry, followed by a moderated roundtable discussion. Our second session, which will run from about 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock Eastern, is a follow-up from our initial conversation on launching ESG initiatives that we had at this same event in the spring. But today's conversation will pick up where we left off and focus on how to keep stakeholders engaged and how to measure and report on success of initiatives. And then the final session for today at about 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock Eastern will focus on how supply chain dynamics are impacting investments, primarily from a strategic standpoint. We welcome you to stay on for the entire session if your schedule allows, or pop in and out if you need to. The program is going to be recorded, so if you miss anything, you can catch up where you left off there. I would like to thank all of our sponsors today: FTI Consulting, Capaccio Environmental Engineering, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. Because of their support, we're able to offer this program complimentary. So before I turn it over for our first session, I just have a few housekeeping notes I want to share. As I mentioned, this program is being recorded, so everyone who registered will receive it. You'll also get access to the reports being discussed today, including the state of supply chain manufacturing that FTI will be presenting next, and the PowerPoint slides that we'll be sharing today. And you will have ample time to ask your questions, so please make sure that you feed them in throughout the program in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. All right. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our presenter and moderator for our first discussion, Shannon Mills. Shannon is a senior director at FTI Consulting and will be sharing insights from their State of Supply Chain report. Shannon.
Thank you, Nicole. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, very good. Thank you. So first off, just thank you to Nicole and the entire MassMedic team for the opportunity to discuss key topics today. We have a pretty good agenda for you. We're going to do the panel introduction and then we'll go through some background of our panelists. I'm going to speak and ask some questions to the panelists on the current state of the supply chain for medical device. I just ask that as we go through this presentation, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type those questions into the chat, and then we will answer those at the end. So first off, I would like to introduce Marie O'Malley, who is the Senior Vice President of Commercial Operations at PISA USA. Marie, can you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Marie O'Malley. I am, as Shannon mentioned, currently serving as the Senior VP of Commercial Operations of PISA USA, which is a contract manufacturing ETO sterilization company, working with a lot of Massachusetts-based companies to be their contract manufacturing as well as sterilization partner. Previous to joining that organization, I worked at Medtronic for over 25 years, leading supply management and supply chain for the cardiovascular business, as well as in a corporate role. I took an early retirement in February 2021 and started my own consulting company, working with med device companies mostly around supply management, mergers and acquisitions, and then joined a former Medtronic colleague in the role I'm in today. So look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Marie. Second panelist that we have today is Sridhar Pola, who's enterprise architect at Philips Healthcare.
Hi, I'm Sridhar Pola. Yeah, I've been with Philips, which is largely now focused on healthcare, for over 20 years. I have over 27 years of industry experience. Yeah, so my role currently is as the IT business partner for the precision diagnosis business, which includes ultrasound, CT, MR, and a few others. And yes, for sure, so looking forward to this panel discussion and contributing to it. Yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Brian Johnson, who is the president of MassMedic.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this program. I'm Brian Johnson, I'm the president of MassMedic. Nicole made a great introduction about what MassMedic does. I will just say it's great to be here on a panel. Great to be here with my former colleague and boss, Miss Marie O'Malley. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, thank you, Brian and team. So I want to just start out by introducing some general demographics of the medical device industry, specifically in Massachusetts. And as you can see here, there's around 613 companies, all located in Massachusetts. There's been 19.7 billion in capital raised funding for these companies. This industry employs 25,000 people across the state. As far as medical device patents go, Massachusetts is second in the United States in those medical device patents, and currently sitting at third across all states for FDA approval. So this region, this state is an extremely active state in the medical device industry, and so very, very large contributor to the medical device industry. So FTI was asked to be a part of this, and I appreciate that. We did take a qualitative approach that was used to gather the issues that members of your own community of medical devices were experiencing, not just in the New England area, but from around the United States. Large companies and small companies, companies in the Northeast, companies in the Southwest, from orthopedics to robotics to cardiovascular and surgical support, and also to contract manufacturing and sterilization. So a wide variety of industries were paneled on this or were discussed on this. We have experienced over the course of the last several years a significant amount of delayed and canceled elective surgeries, long lead times, significantly higher costs. It's been the unfortunate norm since COVID-19. No industry has been spared, and certainly not the medical device industry. And while healthcare needs around the world have increased, so has the unprecedented disruptions, which includes what you see on the screen: labor challenges and shortages, raw material shortages, ETO sterilization constraints, and cybersecurity concerns. Industry leaders such as Howard Levy, who's the vice president of sourcing at Zimmer Biomet, who has been responsible for sourcing in various industries for over 25 years, exclaimed that he's never seen challenges in the supply chain as he has right now. Leaders all over the medical device landscape have been pressed to adapt to these challenges by reshoring capacity, building contingency in multiple levels of the supply chain, and driving sustainable improvement to overcome labor and raw material shortages, inflationary costs increases, and the increase in demand. We're going to go through each one of these today and for the next hour or so. When it comes to labor, COVID-19 really did change the landscape pretty significantly, as most of us are aware. Remote work has increased from 16% prior to COVID to 71% after the pandemic. And it's expected that 59% of those are full-time at home. This brings me to my first question to Sridhar. What sort of changes to the labor pool have you seen over the years during and since COVID? And is work from home significant to Philips?
Yeah, I think work from home is very much a big part at Philips, and it was already a big part even before COVID, because that was as you know, most companies right now are global. As a global company, even when we were coming to work, you know, there would be somebody or the other who was remote. So it, for a number of times it made sense to be working remote, but COVID really accelerated the thing. And obviously during COVID, everybody had to work from home. And once that was established, now even after the fact that we've come back to pretty much a normal state, I think the stickiness of the remote working is not going away, no matter what the incentives are. So it's tough to get back to the regular work. The other thing is that, you know, there were some things that were gained out of remote work and a lot of things that were lost. A lot of the loss was, of course, the direct interaction and being able to collaborate and take advantage of the face-to-face communication. But what you gained, and gain or loss, I don't know. But the workday became a continuous workday. You know, you just got up and started working, and especially in a global world, and suddenly the commute was gone, and those kind of things. I think now that we're coming back to normal, people are not able to let go of that extra a couple of hours of work they had, or the extra time that they had to be able to spend time at home and flexibly work. I think that definitely is a problem from a remote work perspective. That was the question, I think.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. And my second question is to Brian. Brian, in your experience dealing with many different companies, do you foresee any changes in the trends of remote working going down?
Yes, I do think that we will see a gradual shift back to more employees going into a physical office. But I do think we are somewhat in the middle of a sort of fundamental shift as to who needs to be in the office, what the office means, what it stands for. You know, I know that most companies now have an adopt sort of a hybrid 3 days in the office, 2-3 days in the office, and then 2 to 3 days remote. But there's a high degree of variability on that, depending on, you know, what stage the company is in. For example, we've had many companies that are in heavy product development mode, prototype development. You know, they've never did remote work. They came in every day, right? And then we of course had companies who were directly responding to the COVID crisis. They had all their manufacturing and operations folks in the facility the entire time. You know, I think certain roles, there is now a cultural shift to remote work. I think, you know, certainly regulatory folks don't necessarily need to be in an office every day. I think, you know, and some other sort of executive roles don't need to be in the office every day. I know that most CEOs I speak to have a high desire to get their employees back in the office on a somewhat close to 40-hour basis, but I think it may be years before we return to something that looks like 5 days in the office. And perhaps if you look at sort of cultural demographics, you know, we may never end up with all the employees, all hands, 5 days a week.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, medical device, you know, when this came up, medical device manufacturers, they've really been forced to make significant accommodations for this workforce shift to the remote, such as digital infrastructure upgrades, improved clarity and measurement of goals, and adopting a relational management approach, being that people are so far away from each other. How's that relational management approach going to work? Some companies have also explored ways to utilize lower cost options as a result of this remote work by filling positions that are remote in other countries such as India, Colombia, Poland, and others. But besides this, we found that medical device companies continue to struggle with staffing technical positions. That brings me to my third question. Marie, can you tell us what skills are in abundance and which are in short supply?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a lot in abundance these days. Maybe on the IT side, but having people that understand the medical device industry and the regulations and having that IT background, I would say that's still a shortage, but there's not a lot, in my opinion, that's in abundance. And I just think of the economy in general. The only thing I could think of is toll collectors maybe, but otherwise, I mean, there's labor shortages everywhere. And your chart is interesting too, like just on the machinists and technicians. Like I've heard that as a common theme and struggle with, both suppliers and OEMs trying to staff their workforce with operators or technicians. But also, as Brian mentioned, like regulatory, quality, people that understand the industry, even strategic sourcing, supply management, supply chain, which have been under a lot of pressure and have required a different level of skill and expertise. I mean, there's a big shortage of experience there. So it's good for people that are in those roles that have a lot of options, but, it's tough for companies to recruit and retain, those talented resources. So, med device continues to be a good industry to be in, but we need to continue to figure out how to get a good pipeline of talent into this industry.
Thank you. Yeah, and it also seems some of these remote work benefits, such as working from home or from wherever, offers a lot of greater flexibility that's beneficial to the worker. It's going to be a tough time seeing that go away in the near future, as Brian kind of mentioned. There's no doubt that the projected growth of medical device is strong, with near double-digit growth expected in many of the medical device categories through 2028. However, we have found that there is a bolus of machinists, as Marie just mentioned, and machine programmers nearing the retirement age, and very little incoming labor in that category. When we were doing research on this, I was shocked. I knew this kind of existed, but was shocked that 76% of the machinists were 40 years old or older, whereas only 8% of the machinists were 20 to 30 age range. So there is going to be a looming gap shortage of this type of skilled labor. We found that for smaller medical companies, this isn't much of a concern, but for larger companies, this continues to be a very big concern. And while this labor is a concern, it isn't the only thing keeping leaders up at night. Medical device companies obviously use a wide variety of alloys and metals such as titanium, cobalt chrome, as well as plastics, silicones, and resins. Due to geopolitical volatility, energy crisis, oil policy, and health concerns, those have all inhibited continuous supply for these raw materials. And you can see on the chart, chromium in short supply due to energy crisis and minor strikes, silicone due to the power supply during the dry season drying up, acrylic resin in short supply due to oil policy that's affecting that. So this brings me to a question to Sridhar. Have you seen any impact at Philips by any raw material shortages? And if you have, can you explain?
Yeah, I do not have any specifics, but I do know that the semiconductor chips in general have affected us a lot. I hope you can hear me, by the way.
Yep,
and this is obviously has been a problem. It can be seen. It is evident because of the fact that it does hinder our ability to deliver. While our order book may be strong, but to be able to meet the demand is a difficulty when you have such shortages. And definitely that's one thing for sure. There could be other raw material aspects especially with acrylic resin and stuff that we do have in certain parts of our businesses that we need. But definitely semiconductor chips has been an impact for us. Yeah.
Yes, thank
Back to
you.
you.
Yeah, and as Sridhar mentioned, of course, we're in the midst of what we're calling the great chip shortage that is affecting almost every industry, including medical device. It was really the perfect storm of significantly decreased demand in early 2020, where consumers stopped buying products and elective surgeries were being delayed, to the end of 2020, where these purchases not only picked up, but grew significantly. Adding to that, the fact that the primary manufacturing of these chips were still recovering from lingering COVID-19 and other variants added pressure to an already constrained supply. What we found out is that these problems highlighted some really significant issues. First, single sourcing of semiconductors was very common. Since then, there's been a rather large pathway to dual sourcing that as much as possible, or using other alternative sources. Many brokers were used to manage the company's supply rather than directly engaging with suppliers. Chip inventory was also very low within medical device manufacturers. And what we're seeing now is a large initiative to grow semiconductor chip industry or inventory levels. Next question is to Brian. In addition to the raw material issues discussed, have you come across any other raw material supply issues that are concerning to the general industry?
Shannon, I think you hit most of the big ones. I mean, the thing is that, since March of 2020, I mean, it starts in March 2020 with the absence of melt-blown fabric, which is the core ingredient to N95 masks, which, is locked up in China, which was the sort of where the first wave of COVID hit. And, I look at that and I think it took about 2 years before N95 masks ended up off of the shortages list by the FDA. But we've since March of 2020 been tracking supply chain shortages all over the system. I think silicone and resins have been always been on the list. And then of course you talked about semiconductors, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But I think what you see is that most of these shortages are really go back to our first topic, which is sort of workforce challenges and the inability to get enough people into the factories to produce these, and the bottlenecks that happen on the talent level. Plus, where the COVID crisis hit geographic areas where we actually sourced most of these materials. The massive lockdown in Germany, I mean, that's a tremendous hotspot for silicones and plastic resins. You think about where the zero COVID policy in China and the lockdowns that have kind of persisted there, and how that has slowed down production of several key areas. But I mean, if you sort of track where there are regions of strength with all of these raw materials, and those materials, have just been sort of deluged by crisis after crisis after crisis, starting with COVID-19, but persisting through in the, Ukrainian-Russian war. And it's quite tough to track. And frankly, but the ones that we see the most are the silicone, the resins, and then semiconductors. And semiconductors is a very interesting challenge. I would say that, where medical device really gets pinched on the semiconductor arena is that we use the same chips for the most part as the auto industry. Mm-hmm. And if you track the buying frenzy of cars coming out of the initial waves of COVID, the incredibly increased demand for new automobiles and for people who have had some money because they were either saved up money or the sort of stimulus money that was given to people who had kept their jobs and had extra cash, went out and bought things. And we had a major supply bottleneck on these sort of older legacy chips that typically medical device companies use. Now, there's been and we've had a lot of interaction with our leaders in Washington over this. The Department of Commerce has been involved, trying to get rated orders so that you can sort of bring that to the big semiconductor companies to try and jump the line for the auto industry. But really the semiconductor companies and medtech, it's a really interesting dynamic, right? Because, we use 1% of these legacy chips and the auto industry uses 99% of them. So, you're talking about, even when these organizations want to do the right thing, you're asking them to have our products jump the line of their biggest customers. So there's some very significant dynamics at play. Now, the Chips and Science Act is going to create a boon for local semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. We're seeing some very interesting things coming up in Ohio and northern New York. I think the semiconductor pinch really was it's most acute in Q2 and Q3. We were hearing some kind of scary stories about things that were going to get pulled off the we're going to be unable to meet orders and things like that, of life-saving devices and hospitals being short products that they need to keep patients alive or to sanitize and products. Some of that has eased down a little bit, as the supply chain has straightened out a little bit. But I think, when we first started looking at this issue, they said 2023 was when we would start to see some easing. I think that's probably been pushed back to late 23, maybe early 24, before we kind of get past all this different, all these different challenges. And I think I just want to touch on one thing on your previous slide that I thought was super important about talent nearing retirement age. And, we see this as this machinist age breakdown. That's a very large issue for our industry. And I think that's an area that none of us are taking, sort of not taking very seriously. And there's a lot of work going on at the state level in Massachusetts to try and produce programs that can pump out more manufacturing talent. These machinists, though, typically are a little more older, they're more advanced in their careers, and they've learned through sort of apprenticeship and things like that. You can't just pump those folks out of VOTEC schools. So, I think I would pay very close attention to this machinist age breakdown, 40 plus. I would think it's probably, the percentage is probably even 50 plus, frankly, I think it's an even older group than we think. So, that is a very concerning stat for our industry. And, that's not something that's just gonna fix itself. I think we have to continue to make sure that we invest long-term in our workforce.
Thank you, Brian. Well, as if labor and raw material issues weren't enough, there's still two more large looming supply chain challenges that we're going to discuss. The next being ethylene oxide sterilization. As most of you probably are aware, 50% of all medical devices are ETO sterilized. What I didn't realize when we were first doing this is that 26% of the facilities in the United States have been flagged by the EPA as having a high emission of known carcinogens. Recent lawsuits and impending updates to the Clean Air Act have and will continue to challenge the sterilization industry. As recently as September of 2022, an Illinois jury awarded $363 million in an ETO emissions lawsuit. This is just the first of many filed against the major sterilization companies. Needham and Company analysts warn that additional lawsuits may be filed against sterilization facilities, as well as major medical device companies. And this brings me to another question. Marie, what has PISA USA done to address concerns on the carcinogen pollutants released into the environment.
Yeah, I guess I've been very involved in ETO sterilization processing as the primary mode of sterilization when I was at Medtronic. So enterprise wide, I kind of led the strategy and have been monitoring and tracking the activities in terms of what the EPA and also FDA is doing. I did join PISA USA about 1.5 years ago, and they had set up a new state-of-the-art facility that has state-of-the-art ETO processing and chambers, as well as emissions control. So, I'm proud to be part of an organization that's invested heavily in having a very safe working environment, as well as an environmentally responsible operation. So the technology that's used breaks down all of the molecules, so there's zero detectable emissions. So we feel like we have one of the safest, cleanest operations that meets or exceeds both US and European proposed standards. So you can get there with significant investments in emissions controls and processing equipment, but it will be a challenge to make sure that the current sterilization providers, invest in upgrading their systems and emission control systems so that, we have clean, safe operations. I do think there's a lot of discussion about alternative technologies, and I think that will be a good solution for a number of companies, but because of the materials that are used in a number of devices, I think ethylene oxide will continue to be, a significant portion of the solution for a number of devices. So we have to figure out how to do that safely and environmentally responsible way.
Thank you, Marie. As of October 4th, the EPA has identified 25 facilities that emit excessive levels of ETO, which is at or above the level of 100 additional cancer cases per million people exposed. The EPA is also in process of updating the national emissions standards for hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act in order to reduce the risk from ETO. Not only will sterilizers need to reduce ETO emissions, but medical device companies must also look at alternative sterilization methods, as Marie mentioned. Desmond Alder, an executive at Gentuity, shared with us that ETO is not used in sterilizing the world's smallest catheter. He exclaimed that challenging or pushing back against the FDA just didn't seem to be worth the time and effort, and instead utilizes other methods of sterilization. BioOne Sciences' David Linehan, Vice President of Business Development, shared that BioOne Sciences utilizes a robotic controlled dose of UV light to sterilize against viruses and bacteria. But that technology currently is used in operating rooms and not to sterilize medical devices directly. This brings me to my next question to Brian. Are there alternative sterilization methods that you have seen that could help companies identify other methods to ensure products are safe for patients?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some. I'm not an expert in the space, but I mean, gamma radiation. I know Marie would know a little bit more about this. Is one alternative, and there's other alternatives that are in the pipeline. Sometimes it's just a matter of whether or not a device can, if there's materials on the device or coatings or something that this could, sort of be harmed by other forms of sterilization, and ETO is currently the standard of practice. I think this is an interesting issue because EPA is really, this is a bit of an unprecedented action that the EPA has done. And, they are not, the FDA is not on board fully with the EPA's actions here. The EPA federally has decided that they're looking at ETO in general, and they're going after contract sterilization tools for medical devices first, probably in advance of a broader action against ETO in general. There are several problems with their claims, a lot of them stemming from sort of ambient air quality measurement. They themselves admit that They don't have good ambient air quality measurement tools in place. So they're sort of, there's a little bit of cart before the horse going on here. And as EPA wants to do a national determination or change the standards nationally, what they're doing is using, what some could call a scare tactic of naming 26 facilities that are, in their opinion, emitting more harmful chemicals than they should. But even that, one of those institutions that they have named, some of those were already meeting the standards before they published those facilities as being in violation. So this is a very strange issue that has, I think fallen onto contract sterilizers, sort of as a first sort of unfortunately being sort of an early targets of this action. So what EPA is doing is they're trying to get state and local environmental protection agency groups to come in and basically try and find violations. And it seems like they're also trying to get employees at these facilities to come forward if they think that their facilities are in gross violation. Now, that's just kind of some of the stuff that we're monitoring here. In general, though, ETO is incredibly important for sterilizing medical devices. And, I think you do have to say to yourself, okay, so there is this, what was it, 101 million, right, chance of increase in cancer risk. Of course, that's, it's anytime there's any increase in cancer risk is very scary and warrants further research. But, I think the idea of significantly disrupting our chain of life-saving technology is quite a higher degree of magnitude of danger to public health. So, I'm hoping that this is a science-based approach here and not motivated by headlines, politics, and lawsuits. So, we're keeping an eye on this. There are alternative technologies. We're by no means an expert, but with every different technology, that you have to sort of look case by case if the device will be able to withstand that. Plus, there's a significant regulatory burden, and when you change any sort of piece of the device life cycle. So, I think our companies are being put in a pretty hard position here by the Environmental Protection Agency. And, I think there's still some debates about the science.
Thank you, Brian. Last topic that we're going to talk about today is obviously we're in an advancing connected world. There's been a significant increase in internet connectivity of medical technology devices such as pacemakers, imaging machines, insulin pumps, implants that can all talk to wearables and that interact with healthcare providers. The benefits are pretty good to both the patient and the healthcare provider, two of which result in fewer in-person visits as well as reduced cost per patient. And the expected growth of this industry is to be 24% by 2026. And there's going to be over 20 billion connected devices by then. So that's pretty amazing. And when you couple all that to the fact that there's strict privacy laws on the personal health information, and while the IoT devices allow for direct intervention for life-saving therapies, the risk to patient safety is also growing as well. In a recent cybersecurity investigation conducted by FTI Consulting, it was found that the magnitude of exposed records and financial losses due to data breaches has increased rapidly. Just this year, Quincy, Massachusetts Shields Healthcare Group detected a breach from malware that involved personal health information of over 2 million of their patients. Despite this being a rising issue, cybersecurity strategies of most hospitals are still focused on traditional centralized information security, which leave most medical devices vulnerable to attack. This brings me to another question to Sridhar. Do you believe that medical devices are more exposed to cyber threats than ever before? Sridhar, are you there? Okay, he must have got dropped off accidentally. We'll be moving on. According to FDA news publication in January 2022, it was found that around 70% of medical devices like MRI machines, heart rate monitors, medication pumps are running on outdated, unpatched operating systems where critical vulnerabilities, which are welcoming entryways for attackers. What's
Hey,
even
Shannon, are you hearing me now? Sorry.
Yeah. So the question.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry. The question was, do you agree that medical devices are more exposed to cyber threats than ever before?
Yeah, I mean, I think you started off the slide with saying that it's a very connected world now, and the fact is that, I mean, this is nowhere near as connected as it's going to become in the near future, right? We talk about Internet of Things, Internet of Medical Things. With every new upgrade that we are looking at, and every NPI, the new products that we're introducing, more and more of those are getting more connected. Hospitals are more connected. Everything is so. Yes, this is the biggest. I mean, cybersecurity is the biggest threat we've had. We've had many, breaches, and there are always, actors that have malintentions that are going after things, and so definitely this is the time for mitigating it. On top of that, if you look at medical devices in general, a lot of these are, our install base is huge. When you look at the big manufacturers, and they're all running, trying to keep up with upgrading those, and that's a constant exercise. And as we grow the number of devices, remote delivery of software, remote upgrade, and remote and early detection of these leaks or these potentials to that others could take advantage of are the thing. And this is from a Philips perspective. This is one of the biggest things. One of the most important things that we are investing in, and dedicated arms, both from a product perspective and when we for each product, and then when we actually provide solutions for hospitals and others as to how we give the umbrella coverage from a cybersecurity perspective. But one thing is that devices go into patients in patients' homes, in hospitals, everywhere. The devices themselves need to be secure. They're going into a network. We have a responsibility to not invite a threat towards the hospitals and patients. And on top of that, we have to secure ourselves at the same time, that we are not potentially bringing something a threat towards ourselves as Philips, or any other company. I mean, I'm sure the other manufacturers and everybody is facing the same kind of challenges, but this is definitely a concern, and is going to remain a concern. And I think it's going to be just like as we are with in other kinds of software, and we are in the regular software world. It's something to keep up with. You just cannot rest in this situation, and that's basically where we stand. I'm sure Brian and others have opinions on this too, but yeah, this is something that you got to stay alert, got to have somebody staying and keeping watch all the time. Yeah.
Thanks, Sridhar. In a recent issue of Healthcare IT News, a study by Poneman Institute found that half of the hospitals have been attacked by ransomware. And of those attacks, 88% of those attacks involved Internet of Things devices with immature and unpatched security or cybersecurity infrastructure. Another question for Sridhar: can you shed some light on solution architecture implications or trends due to these emerging risks?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, so basically, this is this is how we have to organize ourselves. I mean, it's about focus, and these threats are even as regular users of devices within the company for employees and everything. We have to minimize the number of points of entry where things can be taken advantage of, and that's basically what we do. We manage the devices, or we have a very strict guideline on how things are done, and that goes also in product introductions that we do. Now, there's also, as I said, there's an install base, and there are new products that are coming in, and from a architecture perspective, we this product architecture, as I said, and we have dedicated functions for that. And without that particular threshold being met, products are not going out. I mean, besides quality, patient safety, cybersecurity is an equally important step before it goes out the door or goes anywhere near approval or any such thing. And same goes for any solutions that we provide to the hospitals and others. So yeah. So from a architecture perspective, yeah, we even back office software, we put the owners, the amount of how high the threshold is for them to clear the questions and everything, testing requirements, all of that's just what we do within Philips, and I'm sure other organizations are doing it. And you kind of have to hire the talent, and that's another piece. This is the kind of talent that you need to have. It has to have the same mind of an actor that would have the wrong intention, and that's the only way that you can actually build and design something to defend yourself against somebody who has an equally sharp mind. So basically, that's just how we have to do it. There's no other choice here. But yeah, organizationally, we set ourselves up and we build architecture frameworks to kind of minimize the effect on our devices, on our services and solutions that we offer. And yeah, we continue to iterate on that and make sure that it's up to date and it's effective.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, as Sridhar was mentioning, it's necessary that manufacturers, providers, and regulatory agencies work together to manage cybersecurity risks. The FDA has already asked for $5.5 million in funding to develop and staff their own cybersecurity program for devices in 2023. This will help bolster the FDA's authority to implement cybersecurity requirements into their own approval process through the Patch Act, allowing more personnel focused on ensuring sufficient cybersecurity in medical devices throughout their life cycle. In conclusion, the medical device industry is facing unprecedented supply chain challenges across many segments, from labor to raw material to sterilization and cybersecurity, and not only at the supplier level, but down to the supplier and that supplier's supplier. Factors such as market growth, governmental policies, geopolitical issues, and technological advancements are adding complexity and requires organizations to be forward-looking and innovative in solutions while closely monitoring global challenges. Each of the 4 topics discussed traces back to the importance of adaptability in an ever-changing world. As market trends, regulations, and environmental factors evolve, so must organizations and their supply chains, or risk getting mired in the ways of the past. I just want to thank the panel, Sridhar, Marie, and Brian, for each of your time. At this time, we'll take questions if there are any.
Great conversation. Thank you again. We did have one question come in via the Q&A function. I don't know if Brian would be best to answer this or maybe Marie, but going back to the challenges with the EPA and ETO, the question is, the rumor is that EPA is being overly critical of ETO. Is there truth in this?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, Brian covered it pretty well. It should be a discussion based on the science and the data. And I think, this isn't a new topic. This has been going on. And I think, Brian, even when I was at MassMedic, you and I were talking about that of, and AdvaMed has been involved, MassMedic's been involved to some extent, but really working with the EPA, FDA, it is critical for our industry, but it should be science-based. So there has been a lot of, political and social pressures and misinformation about it. I do think, obviously we got to make sure that we're managing things in a responsible way. I don't know if they're being overly critical, but I think they have to look at it in a balanced approach and, making sure that those companies that are operating ethylene oxide facilities have the appropriate emissions controls, but also looking at the benefit it has to our industry, and not only the benefit, but the criticality. You can't just shut down ETO facilities. It's going to have a catastrophic impact on devices and patient care. So certainly, everyone should be running operations that are, managing the emissions to an acceptable standard. I think it's going to be difficult to have zero emissions, but, there should be a standard. So I think, there's more work to be done with the EPA partnering with the FDA. And I will say, I think the FDA and AdvaMed and MassMedic and others have done a good job of trying to get to the facts and the data and the science. And I think that's where, the conversation needs to continue to happen.
Yeah, I would agree, Maria. I think it's the EPA, for their credit, does recognize that this technology is critical to the medical supply chain, and they have said they do not want to do things that will disrupt the medical supply chain. I think that they have concerns, and then they have also themselves in their own communications have said, look, we don't have great, it's not like we have foolproof technology to decide to tell you how clean your air is to begin with. And I think that there's a lot of pushback to say, look, there's ETO in ambient air all over the world, and we're exposed to a lot of this a lot more. And sort of the question is why contract medical sterilizers are their first target. If they want to crack down on ETO, why are they picking this one this one technology, considering how much it has at stake? And it's it's discouraging because they are putting a lot of pressure on these facilities to make extremely costly improvements to their facilities, and in advance of their final ruling in terms of what they're going to require. So I think they're asking a lot of a lot of these contract sterilizers to sort of preemptively act. I don't know about rumors or things like that, but it's certainly something that needs to be a great deal of care needs to be taken with this. But I would think in general, a lot of the themes that we've heard today, really, if you get back to it, a lot of it's around workforce and a lot of it around getting people back into facilities and getting through some of these supply chain shortages. We as a industry need to do more to attract talent to this space. We have a great opportunity right now in medtech to get these workers maybe from other industries to look at medtech. MassMedic has a great program that we've produced called Why MedTech, which is sort of asking companies to tell their why and to sort of inspire people to join this industry. But it's interesting to me that so much of the supply chain goes back to the most important thing, which is people.
Thanks so much. We do have a number of questions coming in around this ETO topic. I think there might be a need for just a little bit more explanation on, is it the ETO technology itself that is causing some potential health concerns, or is it how it's managed and controlled? So can you share any insight on that, maybe, Marie?
I don't think it's the technology, it's how it's the emissions are managed. So, a lot of people have scrubber systems and, stacks, and it's not, it's the claim is that they have excessive ETO emissions. And also some of the older cycles had a high concentration of EO in them. So, most companies are moving to what they call a sustainable cycle. And even some of the larger companies in the industry are saying you can't have more than a certain amount of milligrams of EO in any cycle, but it's how you manage the cycle and then how you manage the emissions of it.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, the EPA is talking about basically amount of ETO sort of runoff from facilities, from everything from the scrubbers to doors and windows, and sort of they're looking at small concentrated areas around these facilities themselves. So it's about sort of leakage from these facilities.
Yeah, it's the fugitive emissions. And I think one of the challenges is, companies set up their sterilization facilities in areas, and with urban sprawl, now they're in, the backyard of a school or in a local community. So there's concerns about it, but it's the fugitive emissions, what, Brian was referring to.
Yeah. And the cancer risk that the EPA is referring to, this 100 per parts per 1 million, is based on a stat that if you spent 75 years within the 1 mile radius of the facility, that is where the cancer risk uptick is. So that's an interesting deep dive into the data there. You'd have I don't believe ETO has even been around that long enough to sort of play that one out, but it's a real, and the EPA on their own communications has said, like, look, basically you have a 36% chance of cancer just by breathing air, and this is an increase of I think it was like 0.01%. So it's concerning, and we have to take it seriously, but I think everything needs to be done objectively and with consequences in mind. And I see here that there is a question about FDA being understanding of the supply chain issues, and that there's some flexibility on the ETO side. I do think the FDA has been a good partner to industry on this, and there are specific people at the FDA who are kind of working with companies, and we can if people want to reach out, we can supply that contact information to them. And
I would agree with that, Brian. I would just comment, there has been some large facilities that have been shut down because of, political shutdowns, and then deemed later to, coincidentally, not to have violated any of the EPA standards. But during that time, it caused companies to have to go look for alternatives in a very short period of time to make sure patients weren't impacted. And I would say the FDA was very cooperative in fast tracking approvals of those new sterilization sites. So I would say some of the fastest approvals coming out of the FDA that I've seen are on qualifying and approving new ETO sterilization sites.
Yeah, it's a great point, Marie.
Thanks so much for that clarity and that extra information. So we do have a few other questions, but we are running up against on time to go to our next session. So what we're going to do is we'll share those with the panelists following, and we'll make sure to follow up with you following the presentation. So thank you again to all of the panelists on this session. Thank you to FTI for your support in creating the State of Supply Chain report. If you want to download the whole report, please go to massmedic.com and you can find it under resources. Again, just want to say thank you to all of our sponsors, FTI Consulting, Capaccio Environmental Engineering, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. And now we are going to transition into our second panel of the event. So I will say goodbye to our current panelists and hello to our next round. Thank you very much. Now we're going to be talking about ESG. So this is a follow-on conversation from what we started in the spring. And this one's really going to dive into how to engage stakeholders, how to keep them engaged, and how to measure and report on success. Rachel Robinson, our Chief Operating Officer, is going to be leading the conversation today. So I will turn it over to her. Rachel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So wonderful to join you all for this event. I will say it has been so long since I actually did a panel discussion on a webinar. It almost feels weird again, which I'm happy to say because it means we're all getting back in person. So it's been a wonderful experience, kind of working with everyone over the last few years. So thank you all for kind of sticking with us and loving virtual events. So I am Rachel Robinson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at MassMedic. And I have been so fortunate to be a part of these conversations on ESG and sustainability. So ESG and sustainability are obviously huge pieces and components of our ecosystem, especially as we just kind of come off that conversation talking about ETO sterilization. I think we decided to stay a little bit away from that one too much in our panel discussion, but curious to kind of keep that conversation going if any of you have questions when it comes to understanding sustainability practices around things like sterilization. So we are going to get started, and what we tried to do with this conversation, as Nicole just mentioned, it's a follow-up to our conversation this spring, where we laid out some of the reasons why sustainability are incredibly important for medical device companies and folks working in this industry. We got some outstanding positive feedback from everyone and said, okay, why don't we take this discussion to the next step and try to help everyone understand what some of the best practices and top tips are for establishing your own programs internally. So my wonderful panelists are here to have this conversation with me, and we have kind of turned this into, I would say, 8 or 9 kind of top tips. But the idea is we would love your conversation to be a part of this discussion. So please, as we go through these tips, do not hesitate to pop your questions into the Q&A. We would absolutely love to answer them in real time, so don't feel as though you need to wait until the end. So I'd like to start by asking my wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. So quick, who you are and the company that you're working for and what you're doing. So Lisa Brady, why don't we start with you?
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name's Lisa Brady, and I'm the Vice President of Global Sustainability, Chief Sustainability Officer for Insulet Corporation.
Okay, Alyssa, why don't you go next?
Hi, everybody. My name is Alyssa Cattle, and I run the procurement and sustainability program here at Thermo Fisher Scientific.
And Lisa Wilk.
Hi, I'm Lisa Wilk. I'm the CEO of Capaccio Environmental Engineering, and I work with companies to help them develop and implement sustainability programs.
Awesome. So when we started to have this kind of panel discussion prep, as I said, we thought we'd kind of turn these into tips. And I thought maybe I'd break the first tip that we came up with for everyone when it comes to setting up, sustainability and your tips for success. And then let's talk through it. So tip 1 was understanding the need to recognize the culture of your company and to know what creates change within your organization. So Alyssa, I might ask you to start off on this. We talked about it as kind of metrics 101. So can you share a little bit about how you would think about driving this within your own company's culture?
Sure. So when we were talking with Rachel in advance of this, we were trying to get to, what is the right metric? What should you measure? What do you need to be successful? And I think we all just started thinking about, in ESG, there's different schools of thought when it comes to setting your goals and targets. And some folks have a culture of setting a really aspirational target, something toned from the top that says, this is where we're going. We might not feel 100% confident with how we're going to get there, but we know that the aspiration is going to drive and energize progress, and that we want to show a very strong ambition. Other companies, perhaps more conservative in their approach, in that they want to understand that a metric is something that they can meet or beat. So I think what we were talking about as a team was just, how does your organization work? How do your senior leaders, people that you're going to need to get buy-in from, to get resources, to implement projects and get funding for things, what do they respond to? Do they respond to this really large ambition, aspirational goal, something in the future where they can just show measured progress through time, or are they wanting something where they're very clear through line towards that meet or beat concept?
how can you go about and understanding, we've talked a lot about changing of behavior, right? It's all about behavior change. What are some ways that people can go about kind of making those goals, right, around behavioral change? How do you decide as a company what is most important for you?
I can jump in there.
That's to the whole group. Okay, yeah, that was what I was gonna say. That's a whole group.
So I think we may have touched on this a little bit last time we got together, and I don't know if we have a lot of the same audience or not, but a materiality assessment helps you to understand what's most important to your stakeholders and what's most important to your business. And that helps you narrow down that wide range of issues that you could possibly tackle, to understand what things you're going to be able to influence, where you have the greatest impact, what capabilities do you bring? Every company has different capabilities. They have different types of talent. They have different types of commercial markets, right? They have different types of products. And so there's different concerns. It depends how global you are, right? So you have to be looking at all these different pieces to say, okay, who are our stakeholders, right? Who are the stakeholder communities? Where do we operate? How do we go to market? What's the types of products we make? And you have to build that in, because that's the essence of part of the culture of your company, right? If you're a company that's really innovative and is into technology, you're going to hit on a certain set of issues differently than a company that's more around agriculture, or so I mean, certainly in med tech, we're definitely more in the technology space. And so there's a lot of advancement around technology, around manufacturing, right? And those are the areas where we have to be sure that we're connecting what we do in sustainability and the issues that we're addressing to the types of products we're creating and putting out on the market. And so definitely around our advanced manufacturing and the advanced technology pieces. And then what are we doing around specifically things that are specific to our area? So, you mentioned EO. There's processes in the making of our products that are industry specific, right? So you have to be addressing those. There may be data privacy security things because of the types of products we're making. A lot of companies are trying to digitize what they're doing. That may extend their reach to another set of stakeholders that you have to think about when you're determining that. But all of these things, your capabilities and your talent and what you're driving to do in your business imperatives, are shaping the culture to shape where you plug in to the types of goals you want to set, the issues you want to be managing, the risks that you may have, as well as those opportunities that you want to go after to differentiate yourself. And you have to build that into what the culture is of your company and how you operate and how you make decisions, because you don't want sustainability to be this additional thing that's off on the side. You want it to be integrated into the way you run the business, which takes a long time if it's a new space for a younger or a less mature company. How do you build that into the decision making as you set up your operations and as you expand your operations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa Wilk, I might ask you, when companies come to you to work on a project, what are some of the big stakeholders that you see regularly? Who are the folks that are most invested in this?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to echo to what Lisa Brady said about doing a materiality assessment, because I think that's sort of helps you focus on who are those stakeholders for your company. So for a publicly traded company, they're much different than a privately held company, for example, or this may be investors that are stakeholders, but stakeholders can be your employees, because you're trying to attract top talent. And right now, sustainability is a very heightened in the minds of talent, and especially in the tech industry. And so it can be that. It can be within your company, you know, different functional areas have certain areas of interest, and so they can be internal, they can be governmental stakeholders, non-governmental agencies, you know, so there's a wide variety of potential stakeholders, but I do think before you set any objectives, you have to understand what's material to your stakeholders, to what's material to your company, and you know, like the other speaker said earlier, that's sort of what helps guide you in setting the culture or the tone for how you're going to establish, you know, your objectives. So, and connect in a meaningful
So
way.
this might be, it might be a dumb question, but how do you do a materiality assessment? This is for the whole group. I don't want to put you on the spot, Lisa, but that's something that maybe people don't know what to do or even how to start with that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a more formal approach that you could do through is the Global Reporting Initiative that has a whole series of guidelines of how to do that. But you could do a less formal one and just follow the principles of it as well. And, you know, it depends on where you're at in your company and where you're heading, what makes sense for you. But, you know, it does involve looking at who are all your stakeholders, what are all your potential impacts. I think we're mostly talking about the E and ESG today, but, you know, it could be environmental, social, or corporate governance. And so, and looking at your operations and how the impacts of your operations. So, you know, we were talking with one company that was immediately going to go to greenhouse gases, but they really didn't generate a lot of greenhouse gases, but they just heard it in the news, you know, and so that's why they were jumping there. But you have to think about what's material to what you do in your organization. So.
And
That was
I would just add,
awesome.
if you don't
Thank you.
have the, you know, if you're a startup company and you can't employ like somebody to come help you to do a materiality assessment, like there's a lot of free information. Even, I mean, if you just Google in the side as we're chatting, you know, it's a pretty basic 4-quadrant can get you started, and the things that you already know about your company and the stakeholders you know can get you started. Before I was at Thermo Fisher, I was at a small family-run company and had been at a big company. We didn't have the funds to go out and do, you know, a big consultative exercise necessarily, but we could still take the same principles and understand, you know, interview a few key customers, interview a few key suppliers, talk to some employees and your leadership. Those are your stakeholders, right? Talk, you know, understand what impacts your business. And then I think what you'll find as you do it is you can kind of gut check yourself. Like if you're going to start a sustainability project or an ESG initiative, and it's about something and you're like, this isn't important to my business, probably not material either, right? So it can be a really complex and very nuanced exercise, or if you're small and you're lean and you're fast and you're changing, it can just be a few people in a room sitting down and having a meaningful think through here about what your company can do to be impactful.
Yeah, and I think the key thing there that Alyssa is talking about is the communication piece, the feedback piece. So you can't isolate and do an assessment of where you start only with your own sustainability folks. It has to be an exercise of speaking with your stakeholder community. And it doesn't have to be everyone, but representation of that stakeholder group. And you know, payers and healthcare providers, all of them, just at least a sampling. And it could be through an interview session, feedback session. It can be through a group session. It could be through a workshop. It could be through a survey. You know, all those things work, but it has to be feedback generated. You can't just say, oh, we know what's important just internally. That's the difference. And then internally, you can cast your lens looking at the cultures we're talking about of your company, how decisions are made. Do you need to create business cases to get these things done? Do you have data to support these different areas, right? So kind of the 101 of where do you even start? Well, you have to start where you have the ability to actually look at some data, make some data-based decisions, right? So, and then again, where you have capabilities that you can leverage, those are all pieces of it too.
That's awesome. Okay, so I think we've covered tip number one, understand the culture of your company to know what creates change in your organization. So we kind of covered tip two a little bit, but I want to just dive into it a tiny bit. How you approach is going to set your course. So talking through some of the various approaches, we said there's, you know, the aspirational goals for a long way off that you just make kind of big picture thinking. And then some companies, they have to have their baseline metrics figured out and the perfect inventory done before they even think about setting goals and milestones. Sounds like a mix of the two might be the best, but I'd like your opinions on kind of both of those perspectives.
But I do think it's helpful to understand where you're at and what you have access to. And even if you're making an aspirational goal, at least you know sort of where you're starting from. And as you establish these goals, which may be a little bit further along, but you want to be able to show progress towards them, and what can you readily show and what can you readily measure, and how accessible is that information, or could it be accessible if it's not currently accessible? And are you going to be able to not just show whether or not you meet that, whether it's an aspirational goal or maybe it's just an incrementally improving goal, but not only are you going to be able to show that you met it, but are you going to be able to measure that the things that you're doing towards achieving it are doing something? Are they making a difference? You know, and so those are some of the considerations when you're looking at what's your current state and what would it take to get to the state that you're aiming for. So.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add to that. Those are all exactly right in terms of how I think most folks look at it. I tend to look a little bit at, you know, what are those things you need to do to have a seat at the table, right? They're the bare bones, basic, you know, these are the things you need to do if you're going to operate a business of X size, right? So whatever the size is, if you're small and you're starting out, what are the bare bones seat at the table things you should be doing just because you're running a business in this country or you have a global business? If you're medium size, you're a large size, what you need to do to have a seat at the table is different, right? And so what are those things that kind of creates an initial threshold of the must-dos as well as the regulatory environment? So what are those things you have to do to be compliant? Where are the regulations heading that you know take many years to drive to? So if something's going to take 2 to 3 years to get done, when do you have to start to do that? So there's the seat at the table. And then the second piece is around differentiation, right? We're all trying to, you know, get market share and do great things for everybody. And so how do you differentiate yourself? You can't be all things to all people. And you have to really understand which items have the best business case, the best return on your investment, and drive the most value creation for your company. And so there you're picking and choosing a lot of times based on feedback and what you have capabilities to leverage on to determine what are those couple of projects or programs you want to go drive that are going to differentiate you from everyone else in the marketplace. So it's not as black and white as I'm describing, but it's a great way to kind of start thinking about where you start and how you approach.
That's really helpful. I think it's almost interesting though, because it comes back to the scenario that was just discussed. Where we're going to reduce emissions. Well, you weren't actually putting that many emissions out there to reduce. So on one hand, great, have an aggressive goal. On the other hand, but the question I have then comes in: what is more important? Or are they equally important, the change and the perception of the change, right? Because I mean, with what we're talking about, it's not just what are you doing, but including the piece about differentiation and understanding how to attract talent and putting yourself in the market. Where do you focus first? The things you can reasonably like make a big impact on internally or externally, or is it both?
I mean, my perspective is you want to be able to walk the talk. So maybe it's a more conservative perspective, but I'd like to be able to show competence and, you know, that enough commitment to moving in the right direction before we go shouting to the world about our performance. And I think that's really important. You say, like, we're talking about talent attraction, right? So Lisa touched on competitive differentiation. What do your customers think about you? And that's, marketing is key to success of any company. You've got to strike the right balance. If we're talking about talent attraction, a lot of people want to come to work at a sustainable company. You want to sell them the reality, right? The challenges and the opportunities, what's happened so far. Because you don't want them to arrive and realize, like, wow, they were really good at selling the story, right? So that my personal opinion is, like, get your train on the tracks. You don't have to be, not everything needs to be done, but you need to have, like, commitment to where you're going. And then you can't ignore, of course, the promotion of your efforts, because that creates a fortuitous loop. It gives you an ability to make future investments, but get started and be able to show something, and then that work speaks for itself. It's my experience.
Either Lisa want to add to that, or are we good? Because I think that was great.
Blunt, but
Good advice.
Yes. Okay. So, okay, great. So, I think the key kind of takeaway there is be realistic, right? But do something instead of not doing anything, right? You can kind of get into that analysis paralysis and not move anywhere. And that is something that I think we all face in a variety of ways. But doing something, even in an incremental way, to understand where you're at and where you want to go is better than being too overwhelmed to kind of get started. So that was tip number 2.
I do think too that if you think about integrating with the other functional areas of the business, you get broader support and you'll actually move much closer to that target than if you're just off on the side doing a nice thing to do, and so I think, that's another, especially if it's early on and you're trying to build momentum, it's helpful to do that. So.
Awesome. Okay, so tip number 3, know what you actually want to track. So can we discuss some of the common data sets in a sustainability report? So folks who have never had to put one of these together, what are some of the things that are included, and what are some common internal goals that people set?
Well, the common categories probably, the goals might vary, but the categories might be, water use, water recycling. It could be waste generation, recycling as well. It could be, and waste could be solid or hazardous waste, but it could be energy, electrical, could be, any of those things. Sometimes it's a specific, chemical or something like that. That's, and of course we see climate change in the news all the time. So there's, carbon footprinting or greenhouse gases, those kind of things. And then the specifics can be all over the place depending on someone's programs, but I'm sure Lisa Brady and Alyssa can add to that too. So.
Sure. So there's different standards of reporting, and so there's some general indices that a lot of companies will report to, and I think Lisa hit on some of the really big ones in the E space, the environmental space. The other one I'd add in there is health and safety.
Yeah.
So what you're doing in environmental health and safety, and what you're reporting, and some key metrics there are usually quite important, particularly in our space. And product stewardship tends to go a little bit beyond recycling now and gets into, potentially circular economy goals and targets. And then there's the other side. There's beyond the E around your quality and your quality controls and what you're doing there. There's social impact and metrics around social impact. There's compliance, like anti-corruption, privacy, security, all the governance pieces. And then there's, marketing and what you're doing there for governance and ethics. So there's a pretty wide variety when you talk ESG. And so, but you have to know what you're ready to report. And again, it's a journey, and you take your steps to get there. Oh, and the other one I left out is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the human capital side of metrics is pretty big right now.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add there is that the materiality assessment that we told you to do at the beginning should absolutely inform the things you're going to put in your report wherever possible. You should be prioritizing being able to measure the more material items, and theoretically, those are the things your stakeholders are going to want to hear about, right? So this is a very fortuitous, self-informing cycle where the materiality assessment drives probably where you want to focus on your measurement, and that drives what you're able to report, which makes your stakeholders feel informed, right? So these are not just activities that you do to check off, they really all build off of one another. But to that point, some of the things that we just rattled off might not be relevant for your business. If you don't use water in a meaningful way, or you don't operate in a water stressed region, please don't divert your resources to measuring water, right? That's just not, everybody is always going to operate, in a limited resource way because we're businesses. So use that materiality to focus on where to improve your measurement.
And I would just want to add one thing. So we're talking about these really big, scary kind of metrics, and you don't have to do the whole thing at once. So there's levels of maturity within each of these categories. So if you're going to focus on energy and emissions, which most companies at this point are starting somewhere there, A, you don't have to have a huge aspirational goal to get started. B, you can start with your baseline metric. And even your baseline metric can be scoped to what you have access to for that reporting year. And you just get better and better each year. So you don't have to worry about the whole thing, all the scopes 1, 2, 3 all at once, and being able to tie off to every invoice for every location that you operate. Like, figure out where you have the greatest amount of data that you can start. You can put in assumptions on some of the others, and as long as you're very transparent and very clear about how you derive those numbers, you can scope it for whatever you're capable of doing and continue to get better every single year and add more data to it.
So that kind of leads us into the next tip, because you just mentioned a lot of things there. And tip number 4 is knowing what is reasonable for measuring progress. Because there's a huge challenge, obviously, in accessing data. I mean, all the data that's out there, it's still really hard to understand how does one even, just lay it out as simple as possible. How does one even start to track? I mean, the water usage, are we just looking at the water bill for your location, or are we talking more than that?
Yeah. If you're just starting, it could be just the utility provider invoices, and a lot of companies track them for another reason that has nothing to do with environmental. It has more to do with operations and costs, and so you may find that that's already being tracked. And there is a lot of software available now, and some of the utility providers can tie directly into it. So that can eliminate a lot of copying off an invoice and putting it into a spreadsheet. And so there's lots of information that, not only in terms of usages by whatever meters you have, but also costs associated with that is in there. And so, you might start with what you have, and, as you progress, if you got more ambitious, or if you're a larger company, you might have smart meters that monitor at different points, but really starting with what you have. And even if you do eventually switch to aspirational larger goals, at least your base is based on something reasonable that you can build with it. I think something important, though, is to understand the sources of your data and get as close to the source as possible, and really keep track of those sources, because as you start to build your program, it can get kind of convoluted. I've seen some companies where, it goes through multiple places within the organization, and then it becomes unclear what is the actual real source of the information. So wherever you start, it can be very simple, but track that going forward and build from there, so. But it could be utility providers,
Yeah.
waste providers, for health and safety metrics, it may be your own metrics that you already track for, OSHA statistics and things like that. So.
This might be a time to plug to work with your procurement or purchasing teams. A lot of the things we just talked about, especially in the environmental pillar, are things you buy. So your purchasing and procurement organization has relationships with the people who you buy those things from, right? Whether it's utility providers or raw material goods, depending what you want to measure, they have those relationships. And in a lot of these spaces where the reporting is becoming more common, those providers have, to Lisa's point, systems and reports and things that they can provide to you. So instead of trying to track down your local paper energy bill every month and key something in, it's very likely that your utility provider may have a free resource you can access to get information on your energy reports. So certainly probe that environment, that purchasing environment, to understand what's possible.
And sometimes you do discover inefficiencies or double counting or, things that actually would drive cost savings. You see that things are set up differently or there's some new opportunities. So it can be a win-win.
The other thing I might ask then, because Alyssa, you brought it up, right? You made a comment about trying to reduce water consumption, but if you're not in an area that really has an issue in that space, or maybe it was one of you, Lisa or Alyssa, pardon me if it was either one of you. How can you understand and harness potentially your local area's environmental goals and understand what their priorities for to kind of help set the tone for what you're trying to do internally?
Yeah, you can, in terms of your utility providers or your water suppliers, you can interact with them to see, how are you relative to the rest of the community and what their goals are. And depending on who your stakeholders are, even if you are a much larger organization, then you might look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and kind of scan those and kind of say, which ones are pertinent to our material to what we do. And if we wanted to set aspirational goals around them, that might be a place you might look. So it could be very local. It could be both, so.
Yeah, I think you're asking a great question. It's something that when I went to Insulet and our headquarters is in Acton in Massachusetts, and it's not an area I was very familiar with. So I actually looked up the town. I looked to see what they're doing, and it turned out they had just hired a director of sustainability for the town. And so I connected quickly with that person to really understand, okay, what are you looking to accomplish? What are your objectives for the town of Acton? We have our headquarters there, we have a manufacturing facility there, right? It's really important. What are the concerns? How can we help each other? How can we be really good partners, operating in your community? And so it was fantastic. It was a great conversation, and we've been trying to collaborate and partner ever since. And so understanding, where you operate and what are those goals and challenges in those communities, as well as your state, right? Understand for the state of Massachusetts, what's the state trying to accomplish and what's business's role in the state. Those are really important things to set some context and actually to drive some behaviors and actions within your company. To say, hey, these are things we need to be doing to operate here. It gets challenging, obviously, with global companies. I'm talking about where our headquarters is, but then you have to be looking in the other regions too. If you're setting up operations in a region or you're putting in satellite offices in another region, you have to be looking at that as well. And then, Alyssa, you might want to talk about, through acquisition, it gets really hard to be tying together all of these things when you're acquiring a lot of other companies and trying to report out and disclose what's going on there too.
great point. I'm not sure we have exactly the full solutions out there, but it's certainly something to consider for growing companies is obviously when you do M&A or you're building new facilities en masse, whatever you're doing, you have a lot of key things you're looking at, will this be a good place to site? Would this be a good business to purchase for a whole host of reasons? And it's really about educating that M&A team or that growth team or that real estate team that there are other components to be considered, like for example, say you want to move, here at Thermo Fisher, we want to move our sites towards being fossil fuel free, which means they're going to need access to a lot of grid electricity to offset things that might have been previously run by fossil fuels. And that means that wherever you're siting this building, not only does it have to have, be good for talent and good for taxes and good for all these things, but also do you have access to enough electricity to not just meet today's demand, but likely future growth in demand. So what kind of easy criteria can you start adding to that checklist for M&A or for real estate so people get people even thinking about, hey, we might be taking on some additional risk here. There might be costs that we aren't really thinking of today that could be incurred in the future.
It's really interesting because we obviously work a lot with the state, and we know that we want we want companies in Massachusetts. We want life sciences here. We want medtech all over Massachusetts. We want to stay and be successful. But there's that fine line of coordinating with the state to say, okay, these companies are not just going to bring jobs, they're going to be responsible social stewards of the space that they are purchasing, that they're leasing, that they're building on. And being able to show that kind of comprehensive planning ahead of time, it has to be just such a light bulb moment when you talk to town councilors and town planners and strategic committees. So if you can do that as you set things up, it's a win-win. But doing it retroactively obviously is a great opportunity too. Even if you don't have it, you're already in a location, great. How can you be a responsible steward of the space that you are taking up in that area and understand the community around you?
And your town knows
Okay.
best they have a long history of interacting with the environment right around them, and they understand what the people that live in the town, how they contribute. And in my last company, what I found, we were in Shirley, Massachusetts, and when I engaged with the town, they had great experience to share. They had put in a town-based solar field, and they had 5 years worth of experience to share and how that went, the challenges, the things that went well. So when we were thinking about it, we could, know how to engage with the people around us in the town. What did the town need? Were there mutually beneficial things we could be doing together? So I think if you're pretty geographically focused, it's really a no-brainer to start just engaging, right? They're your stakeholders. They want it to be a good relationship. It's good for them. It's good for you.
Okay, so before we go on to our last two tips, we did have a question come in. So for each of your individual companies, what would you say is the biggest threat to an ideal sustainability report? Materials, energy, talent, environment, et cetera. So the question's in the Q&A if you guys want to read it as well. But yeah, just what do you think is the biggest threat to an ideal sustainability report? I see some thinking faces.
I think for me, what I think about, what keeps me up at night when we're about to go out and do it, is that our data is valid, that it's accurate, that everything we say in there is accurate and true, and we can stand behind it. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, do we say as much as we could? Were we as transparent as we possibly could be to explain things? So, there are big challenges, there's big issues we're trying to solve, and you're not going to do it overnight. So are we able to articulate that in a way that it makes sense to people, that, okay, we haven't figured it all out yet, but we're making progress towards that, and don't think badly because we haven't solved it yet, but know that we're working on it and we're doing everything we can to progress.
Yeah, I would say, having data that you can trust is really important, and consistency, because you might be reporting data for different purposes. So you don't want to say one thing in your sustainability report and something completely different to the regulatory agency in your environmental emissions report. Or, but also, I think to Lisa's point, you want to make sure that you feel good about that data and you don't have to go back and restate it later because you made a huge error. But better to restate it than be wrong, but you don't want to have to restate it. And I do think you don't necessarily have to have a hugely ambitious goal right away. Or you can have that ambitious goal, but you don't have to meet it right away. If you can articulate that you are committed and to a pathway and you're working on it. So it's sometimes people are hesitant to put the information out there because they're pretty far from where they want it to be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more how it's presented and that you're committed to continually improving going forward. So.
But you also get to choose who you share that with, right? So it's
Yes.
not like you have to create this sustainability report that you are literally sharing with everyone in the internet, right? You don't have to do that. If you start down the process of reporting, you can start with just internal reporting.
Yeah, many companies do that. Like they start with internal, partly because they're trying to really get a clear assessment of where they're at. And I know, for example, on the science-based targets, I know many companies actually spent several years working on it internally before they committed externally because they wanted to fully understand it. So, that's right, Rachel. It could be different purposes.
Yeah, and I think if Ryan's asking, not just about the report writing as its own, but like what is the sustainability topic that's the challenge to actually change, everything's hard, let's be fair. But one thing that I think we have interesting challenge in our industry specifically is on the product side. You have a lot of control over your facilities, a lot of control over your talent population, things you can do, although obviously there's still challenges there as of late as well. The products that we offer, a lot of them have regulatory components. They're not easy to change. Patient care, patient health comes first, of course. And so that has created some unfortunate, unintended probable consequences around waste generation. We're a manufacturing company, and I think we say we make 1 million different products, right? So what does it even mean to be a greener product? We have some programs that we subscribe to, like the My Green Labs Act label, which certainly seeks to help quantify that, but it's such a multifaceted issue. The environment influences and is influenced by products in so many different ways, and you may fix one thing and break another. So I think that's an incredible challenge. It's probably the challenge of our time. Certainly large scale decarbonization is an issue for the world. Proper use of water, being good stewards of other resources is big, but for companies, especially for companies built on products, revenue of products, how are we going to rethink these products? How are we going to show progress and still deliver what the customer requires? And how are we going to work with customers to find that middle ground? To say, okay, I hear that you would like a more sustainable product. What does that really mean to you? And what is the system in which this product is being used that may have to change to make that better? It's great to make a recyclable product, but if the product's not recycled and the system in which it's used is not conducive to recycling, then we're not solving the problem. So for me, products, ultimate challenge, ultimate opportunity. Whoever does it right wins, right?
I think you make an excellent point about driving change in usage, not just change in product, right? Because we have so many opportunities, I think, in life sciences to move from single-use devices or to single-use devices, right? Depending on how the economics and the sustainability kind of work within those products. But if you're not driving the change that is necessary for use of those products, then nothing is actually going to change. So you have to be able to understand how to fit into the workflow of anything that you're creating. and make it usable and safe and effective and hopefully eco-friendly in a way that is going to increase adoption, not just create a product that exists in the world. It's nice that exists, but if no one's using it, you're not doing anything kind of net positive on that. So that's an excellent point on that one. Okay, so we have 2 tips left. The next one is kind of my favorite and how it fits most into this program. It's around how to get your suppliers involved. So tip number 5, understand your supply chain as it comes to sustainability. So what are some metrics and goals that you can reasonably set for your supply chain? And I'm talking just either big picture or individual suppliers when you're asking for X, Y, and Z. Can you guys give me some examples of things that you have asked your suppliers to comply with?
Yeah, I can start. Foundationally, having a supplier code of conduct is a nice basic tool. You do not have to write your own. There are industry standards that you can use, and it really just, it's intended to set the tone. It won't tell you exactly how a supplier performs, but it's intended to set the tone and say, hey, during the engagement, during the relationship, these are things that are important to us, and you can put those right in, you know, you put that reference right into your contract or into your terms and conditions. You can, every time you meet with that supplier in a business review setting, it gives you a reason to have that discussion at a bare minimum, right? So even if you're not prepared to measure your supplier's energy use, because you're over here just trying to figure out what your own energy use is, that's okay. You can still say, we're sending this directional message that these topics are important to us. And then you can say for a certain set of your suppliers, maybe it's just your top few. I don't know, it depends how many suppliers you have, how many procurement people you have, how much you can manage, but you can say for these top few, we're going to drill in one level deeper. We're going to say, do you have systems in place to show that you can comply? So maybe that's ISO standards that the supplier, like 14,001, 45,001, those are the environmental health and safety metrics. If they have certifications, I'm sure, I think that many of your suppliers likely would show you ISO 9001, right, as a quality system metric. This would be the equivalent, but from an ESG perspective. And again, it's striking that balance of, hey, I'm not telling you how to do your business. That's what you do best. But I want you to understand what your impacts are, the same way that you understand your financial impacts on our company, your assurance of supply, your quality. We want you to understand your environmental impacts or your social impacts and share that information with us.
Agree. I think the code is a great place to start because it sets the requirements, like what you're looking for them to comply to, and you can determine from there how you can best help to shape and build capabilities and goals through that. So whether it's, you know, we want you to have management systems and assessments and understand what you're doing, or if you want to first start with, hey, can you acknowledge that you've read the code and you are going to, you know, agree to the set of requirements? Like that could be a goal, that, you know, and a metrics and something you measure and say, hey, for our top spend suppliers, they need to say that they're going to agree to the code of conduct and meet those requirements. Or it could be, you know what, we're moving into a country in our supply chain that we know there's a very specific issue, and we are going to require all suppliers in that country to take a training that we give you on that specific issue. It can be as those aren't simple, but it can be as, quote, simple as something like that. You don't have to be, you know, boiling the ocean and say, you must have science-based targets for all scopes by, you know, 2024. If you don't have to, you can size it and scale it. You can say, hey, by the end of next year, we want all of our top spend suppliers to have a footprint done. Or we want all of our top suppliers to have set a goal, right? And then the next year you can say, okay, now we're going to measure you on, how far did you get to complete that goal, right? Are you meeting the goal? And you just keep upping the ante you know, if you need to do kind of a maturity growth model. So I'm trying to be specific because I think people get stuck to be like, oh my gosh, we have these huge goals we have to create. Break it down into small elements that fit your business and fit your supply network. And once you do that materiality and once you start looking at your data, you'll gain some insights as to where is a good place to start. You'll also look at the relationships you have with your suppliers and where do you have any or lots of leverage, right?
Yeah.
Because leverage is a huge piece of it too. Are you going to take a carrot or a stick approach, right? Are you going to do capability building and push that on them? Or are you going to say, hey, you know what, you must do this in order to do business with us if you want to gain business? And so there's a lot of different things to consider, but it doesn't have to be the be all end all. You want to be clear with your suppliers where you want to wind up over the course of time, but you can also show that there's kind of this endurance path to get there. And I think the last point I'll make, and then I'll shut up for a bit, is you really need to understand your spend. You need to understand where your suppliers are located. You need to understand the risks in those areas, right? Are there climate change risks in those areas? What are your opportunities in these different areas? What is your spend? Where do you have critical suppliers that you don't want to have issues with? You know, you have to figure out your scope and where you want to start. And so understanding your spend, understanding those critical suppliers or those unique suppliers that you have, understanding the locations that might be higher risk, that's where you want to start.
That's great. No, that was awesome. That covered so many of the things. I mean, I was going to ask, you know, how do you make people feel like they're on the same page? But I think you talked a little bit about that as well, right? How do you make them feel as though this is a common goal you're driving towards? Are there specific resources? So say you set these goals, are there specific resources for finding suppliers that meet your goals? Is there software that exists? I mean, I'm in medtech. We like to software everything. But how do you go about kind of finding finding suppliers that are going to kind of help hit those goals that you've set for yourself and for them?
Probably depends on the supply chain, but a lot of procurement tools now, even, you know, in the supplier discovery and onboarding phase, they're creating an ESG component. So if your procurement teams already own, you know, tools for that, a lot of those tools are building in a dimension related to ESG. You can also include some basic questions in an RFP if you're bidding work or you're trying to select a supplier. And it doesn't need to be a laundry list of 100 questions that every supplier needs to fill out. It just needs to give you a sense of like, am I walking into a business relationship where I feel that the supplier has, you know, adequate understanding of what we're trying to do here and can support us. And if not, and we still need to do business with that supplier, maybe have some work to do, right? Because the answer is that these suppliers are going to be at all stages of the maturity model. You're not going to be able to look across your supply chain and say, yeah, most people are good or most people are insufficient. It's going to be the full range. And when you need to go into business with a supplier who has a specific capability or operates in a particular place, if you come to find through that exercise that they don't have what you need yet, you're basically taking on an obligation to meet your goals, to do the education and capability building. And you need to be prepared for that in a business relationship and have a partner that's willing to go on the journey with you. So yes, I mean, there's tons of data scraping. You'll find a tool for everything these days. AI will save us all. But also you could just do some pretty basic, you know, question and answer during if you have a more manual process.
That's awesome. Okay, so we have one last tip and we just have 5 minutes left. So we answered the one question that came in, but if anybody has any last minute questions, now is the time to pop those into the Q&A. But you know, the last tip is really don't reinvent the wheel, right? Other people are doing it and doing it successfully in one way or another. So are there any kind of examples of positive progress that you guys would be willing to share, or something that you're especially proud of that your team is doing in this space? Leave it on an encouraging note, because we just talked about all the challenges.
Well, you know, I do think companies, like Alyssa's company and Lisa's company, do a really good job of trying to engage their suppliers, and I think that is something to be proud of, to be able to help their suppliers grow, so it not only meets their needs, but it helps them become better. And it is a gradual process. And and it may sound like a simple thing to accept a code of conduct, but really you're setting a tone that shows a future direction. And as a supplier, if you want to distinguish yourself, and if you want to, be highlighted as a strong, you kind of see, oh, what do I need to be focusing my efforts on? And even if I'm not there today, it gives you a direction. So I do think engagement, and I've seen companies, try to help suppliers where if it's not something that's proprietary, to kind of share some best practices and learn from each other as well. So that can help.
I mean, really concretely, I'm excited. We have our, I think, first 2 fossil fuel-free sites, manufacturing sites, and that's super exciting to me because it shows that this is not a theoretical idea, right? If it's something that's we've now shown is possible. I'm excited for those of us here in Massachusetts. The new building, computer science building at PU, is also fossil fuel-free. So it can be done here, even in our cold geography, in our city, in our old city. So I do think, obviously there's macro, big problems to solve, but like every time we show an example of one success, it says, okay, keep going. You can do this, keep going.
Yeah, and I think that I'm going to go back to the very beginning of our conversation about building it into the DNA, building it into the culture, building it into the decision making. I think one of the things that I'm really proud about at our company is that we've been on this journey for a very short period of time to have a dedicated strategy and focus areas and all of that. And people have really leaned in. We've accomplished quite a bit in a short period of time, and embedded some of the best practices into the different functions, so that as they're choosing suppliers and new regions, like that's all part of it. It's the code of conduct and the new requirements, and it's all part of the decision making. And they're able to say, hey, you know what, I really like this supplier, but I'm going to go with this other one because this one's not willing to work with us from a sustainability, from an ESG standpoint. And I do want to give a shout out. Our engineers have been phenomenal, and they are doing a lot around designing for sustainability, and designing for environment, designing for circularity, recycling, reuse, and things like that. And that's been a pretty great success path for us.
That's awesome. And that's a key example of getting all of your stakeholders involved, right? And each one of the things you all just mentioned, it's understanding who are the most invested in this process internally, and then getting those goals together that you can then share externally, which is incredibly important. So before I turn things over, I want to just give those tips one more time for folks, and we're happy to send them out. But understand the culture of your company to know what change you can create within your organization. Understand your approach for kind of setting that course. Do you need to set big aspirational goals? Do you need metrics? What do you have access to data-wise? Know what you're trying to track. There's a lot of information online, and obviously these women are an outstanding resource for you about sustainability reporting and what some of those common data sets are. Know what's reasonable for measuring your progress, right? Again, know what data you have, what do you have access to. Start simple, start small. Understand how to get your suppliers involved. So it's not just an internal component, right? This is going to be something that's going to be outward facing for a long time. And then don't reinvent the wheel, right? Learn from what others are doing. The internet is dark and full of terrors, I like to say, but it's also got some good information on there if you go searching for things. So really look at what people are doing and doing well, and try to use that as a little bit of a pace car or a goal line to set, and be realistic. So thank you to Lisa, and Alyssa. You guys are just outstanding to work with as always, and appreciate you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Rachel, for moderating an amazing conversation. I hope you all took some notes and are able to leave that conversation with some great takeaways for engaging your stakeholders and reporting on success. We're now going to move into our last conversation of the day, but I would be remiss before we do if I don't take one more opportunity to thank our sponsors, FTI Consulting, Capaccio Environmental Engineering, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. This last conversation of the day is going to focus on how supply chain dynamics, which we all know are shifting, is impacting investments, specifically with strategics in mind. So as always, feel free to feed your questions in. We will be taking them during the conversation, so put them in the Q&A function at the bottom. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Harmon. John is a stakeholder at Wolf Greenfield. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Nicole. So as Nicole was saying, the topic we're going to be going over in this panel is how the current labor shortages and supply chain issues are affecting developments at companies, as well as mergers and acquisitions from the perspectives of investors and strategics. Just to start with some brief introductions, as Nicole mentioned, my name is John Harmon. I am a shareholder at Wolf Greenfield. We're the largest IP-only law firm in Boston, work in a number of different technology fields and range from brand new startups to Fortune 100 companies. So with that, Antonio, how about you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Antonio Sanchez Cordero, Vice President of Strategy and Business Development M&A for Thermo Fisher Scientific's Specialty Diagnostics Group. I recently joined Thermo Fisher from Becton Dickinson. My first disclosure is that I'm not a supply chain expert, but I have closing off transactions and letting out due diligence that I've developed a perspective on this topic. And just briefly, I've been doing this corporate development, M&A, corporate strategy for 15 years, both in the US and in Europe. And I look forward to the discussion today.
Excellent. And Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Jeff DaCosta. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development at Philips, based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Been here for about a year. Before that, a number of years at Medtronic and Covidien. I'll give the same disclosures. I'm not a supply chain expert, but do see for years have been working with companies on the transaction side and have seen some of these issues come to the forefront. So look forward to today's discussion.
Excellent. So to start with, Antonio, for the deals that you've been working on, have you primarily seen supply chain issues, labor shortages, or both that are impacting the companies that you're working with?
Yeah, it's a great question, John, and I'm sure different people will have different perspectives. I think from my perspective, the main change during and post-COVID was related to supply chain issues and the effects on deal timelines and actionability. I think the first phase, we were looking for COVID-free assets, right? So assets that were not affected by COVID. And then sort of we move into a second phase of more taking into account the disruption of COVID in all the facets of business, including supply chain. I think now we're at a phase where it's taking into account supply chain and product design and choice of materials. And I think this one is here to stay, right? Try to sort of secure or bulletproof the business against some of these disruptions that are probably here to stay. I have not seen labor shortages as a challenge specifically. It is certainly a dynamic situation, and within certain business, we've seen as a trigger for some of this business to do better or have a challenge, but not necessarily from a deal perspective.
And Jeff, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, a few things. I work a lot in terms of looking at early stage companies, especially in the cardiovascular and peripheral vascular spaces. So for a lot of them, the near term or the long term supply chain issues aren't a huge concern. It's one of those things that it will get figured out at some point. It's a near term issue, but the supply chain is very much a discussion for virtually every company. It can be one component. It could be a manufacturing cost increase. It could be who to work with. It's very much in the lexicon of most companies that I'm speaking with. So just want to, for those attending this call, I'm sure that's on top of their mind. But it's I think most know it's not just a one company event. The only other thing I would add as well, not so much on the labor side, but there are certain instances where in the overall scope of inflation, rent, if you don't have a rent payment that, or if the lease is coming up due, or I know of one company that got some great leasing terms in 2020, short-term lease, that now getting a balloon on top of that. So a lot of things just contributing to provide headwinds to companies that may not be flush with cash. Those that have the cash can weather some of these better than others. But yeah, just a series of events that all come back to supply chain and or inflation.
Okay. So for pre-COVID transactions, supply chain issues almost seemed as if they were secondary issues that people just have tagged at the end of the agreement. And it's like, yes, they're a consideration that you have to think of, but it seems like that's become much more important over the last couple of years. So from your perspective, how has this changed, and how sensitive are investors and strategics to supply chain issues at potential targets?
Yeah, I can take that, John. I think very sensitive, right? I think to your point, supply chain was always part of the diligence, right? But I don't think it had necessarily the amount of focus that it has since then. I think the first aspect is, if the target has not been able to build a robust supply chain, right? Why would the acquirer be able to, given the added complexity that the supply chain of the acquirer most likely has? And so I think that's something relevant, early in the discussions. And then it sort of triggers, this discussion about how has supply chain being considered from a product design perspective, how is it considered from an operations, from a sourcing perspective. So I think that, to your point, those were topics that were not necessarily top of mind, prior to COVID, prior to this, current ongoing phase of disruption, and certainly are way more relevant in my experience since then.
Yeah, I'll add to that point, or those points. Don't really remember it being a big issue unless you knew that there was a rare component, and there are many instances in our industry where that's the case. But these issues have gotten much bigger than that, where there's always something involved. I'll reiterate that I don't think that supply chain has affected anybody's, or at least hasn't affected our strategy. The strategy is you're still looking at good assets, you're still looking at things that support a well-baked strategy, but where things do come into play on the transaction side are probably most notably the financials, and how attractive does the deal work, and then on the implementation side, if there isn't a clear plan to go forward, or if the plan is a little bit more precarious, that may not be. That just gives another reason to not do something. Adding, I think also, so often in a transaction, it's the acquirer will figure it out. Okay, maybe that's a harder puzzle to solve, and so it's not quite as clear that that's going to be the next step. So you have a series of little things. I wouldn't say that any of these are deal killers unless it actually is that rare component that can't be sourced. But when there's just a lot of little things that come up into discussion, much like how the term supply chain has made its way to the kitchen table, and when that never existed a year or two ago.
Maybe building into what Jeff was saying, and I think it's a subtle but very relevant point, right? That from a strategic perspective, I think a robust but suboptimal supply chain, we can think about how to optimize it, right? We can think about with scale how to improve the cost of goods, but if it's not robust in the first place, it's a big question mark about can we get it robust? So as we think about sort of risk adjustment, when we are reviewing targets, I mean, that's certainly it's an aspect that in discussions with targets, and I certainly advise companies that think about how much risk and how much question marks are you putting in the table for the strategic or even for the institutional, for that matter, because it's easier to imagine how we can optimize it down the road and the upside that represents than figuring out can it actually be done in a more robust fashion.
Mm-hmm. So what are examples of the types of supply chain issues that you're actually seeing occur in reality with the potential targets that you've been working with over the last year, 2 years?
I'll throw in a couple, and then I'm sure Jeff has other ones. But I think, for instance, something as simple as lack of supplies becoming a challenge for receiving samples that are relevant to continue conducting clinical trials required for regular submission, right? I mean, if you don't have the tubes that you need to be able to collect the samples, well, that affects, and this is a specific instance I'm thinking whether that was a challenge with the last year and a half. But also, I think an example, John, to your previous question about labor shortages, I mean, certainly you see more than one and more than two companies where labor shortages leading to less number of procedures in the hospital, being a challenge for continued clinical trials and ultimately getting clearance, as well as obviously affecting performance, right? I mean, in this context, when that affects performance, it's another question mark, about why that's the case and how do we assess it. So I think those are a couple of examples.
Yeah, I think one that I'll call it. I've heard so many people, so many companies cite this. So for those that are listening to this webcast and have experienced it, definitely empathize. Tyvek has been one packaging component that has really led to a lot of delays for manufacturers and getting packaging. So it's led to some creative sourcing, but that also trickles down the supply chain as to foil and other types of packaging. So that even cascades into other types of delays there. I think that also a relevant, where I see it on the early side of companies, is where manufacturing so often at an early stage, you're trying to get your costs down, and it seems like it is a very stiff headwind where it's harder and harder to prove it, and so when you're getting when you have when you have a number of components into your bill of materials, and several of them are on very short lead or very long lead times or just elevated costs, that just doesn't help get you down the curve. And so we've seen some of that. I think that if you've got a longer term strategy, you can see the path toward getting there. But it is harder. And so when you're trying to make decisions based on hitting a certain COGS number or designing in a certain way, and it's created causing companies call some audibles and doing something. In the worst cases, it's just delaying time and burning cash and resources. So it's usually what I found is what's great about this industry and what's great about the people working at it is most people are resourceful, and there's never been any fatal, okay, the company's done, can't solve it, but it is creating a lot of headaches and causing angst for a lot of people.
That actually leads directly into the next question then. What are the types of impacts that you're seeing from the current supply chain and labor issues having on smaller companies and targets? For example, you mentioned things such as delayed approvals, increased burn rates, etc.
From my perspective, all of the above, right? I mean, I think that's affecting companies in multiple ways. I think certainly delayed approvals. I'm seeing that increased burn rates, worsening P&Ls, and worsening performance. And I think the challenges, some of those can be explained. Others are still hard to assess by the acquirer, whether strategic or financial. So I think that is the challenge at the moment. Is there's a lot of companies suffering, and some of that suffering, it's a bit unfair, right? It's driven by forces from outside the business that it's hard to control. So I think that it's relevant that strategics and financial investors, we spend the time trying to understand what's driving some of that disruption and what can be fixed. And I think in my mind, I kind of put them into buckets, scale and complexity, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in a second. I think the complexity are hard to figure out, but scale is certainly one that is part of the work we need to do.
Yeah, and when you carry this out, there's a lot of domino effects here. And I think that's maybe the worst thing. I think most people understand what's going on in supply chain. It's a reality. But where it becomes an issue is, okay, now we've got a 6-month delay. Now this means 6-month delay until sales. That means 6 months longer of higher costs. There's a lot of just issues that go on there, to the point where it's okay, now do we need to find a new plan? Maybe building it ourselves isn't the right solution. Maybe it is, and depending on where you're going. So it's just creating a lot of probably a lot more time spent thinking about things where it just wasn't, we weren't, all we wanted to do was design a product, get it FDA approved, and move on. Now there's a lot of other issues along the way. But just adding a few more, that some other issues, just getting final lockdown, which then leads to a delay of getting to FDA approval. Getting maybe that packaging can't submit until you get the full the full scope of materials. It's a headache, and I'm sure those listening on this webcast appreciate all of this. And just mentioning these things to give some color to it, that it's stuff that we're seeing every day as well. I wish we had a magic wand to create to also cite solutions, and maybe we'll get into a little of that, but just giving the perspective that people are out there dealing with this.
Maybe going towards that idea of coming up with solutions, one of the first things that people need to be able to do is they need to be able to identify those issues that they should be aware of. So as you noted, many of these types of delays often lead to domino effects that may knock all the way down to delayed regulatory approval, increased burn rates, et cetera. But what are those important types of delays that, quite frankly, small companies and targets should be looking out for now to try and nip this in the bud so that they don't become larger problems, as you said, from domino effects?
Yeah, I think the regulatory submission has been one that I have seen come into play, just based on the fact dealing with early stage companies. It's I think, well, I don't know that there's much that can be done beyond the obvious of alternate supply sourcing, alternate supplier, and beyond the normal creative approaches. I do think it's important that if you're looking at either financing or projecting yourself out for financing, to be sure that you factor these into either your timing, and that you've got enough, that you're planning your cash resources appropriately, that you're not misleading yourself or others. I do want to reiterate that there is just a general acknowledgement that there are issues here. So I've yet to be in a conversation where it's been effectively, I can't believe you didn't plan for this. Like it's more of, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. What is out there? I only caught the tail end of the prior session, but I do want to reiterate something I heard at the end, is about using the internet and finding and working and trying to find what other people are doing. I do think that in terms of solutions, and trying to mitigate the time of impact, it's important to reach out and have maybe those conversations earlier on, either with maybe strategics or other investors, and have those conversations early in the process rather than late when it starts to become a problem, because there's just, given how much is acknowledged out there, people are trying to work to do it. So don't let the timeline dictate you. You can have at least a little bit more control.
Yeah, and I think that's very right. I mean, I think the more proactive that the company can be about talking about those potential challenges. I mean, nothing is more disrupting to an M&A process that something like a surprise, down the road. And if you knew about it, I mean, we could have talked about it. It just helps to socialize that early. I think the other point is it's hard to tell what to look for, because I think it's time to be a bit paranoid, right? I mean, what we've learned over the last couple of years is suddenly, a ship sort of gets stuck in the Suez Canal, and now suddenly, that becomes it. And there's all these things that we did not anticipate, right, that have been happening. And so it is really hard. I mean, when I talk to my colleagues in operations, I mean, you have to be a bit paranoid these days and try to anticipate that. But I think for me, it goes back to, I mean, and I think it's a bit different for those that are pre-commercial from those that are commercial, right? Because anything that might affect your commercial performance, sort of for me, would be sort of top of mind if you are at that point. Anything that affects sort of your submissions, your regulatory clearance, if you are pre-commercial, would be, what I would keep as top of mind.
Excellent. So how do you see supply chain issues from the perspective of a strategic or an investor? When you're looking at those issues, how does it impact both your perception and the way that you actually review a deal relative to what you would have been doing a couple of years ago?
I think the first point that Jeff mentioned before is and you said it as well, John, is more top of mind, right? It's more prevalent, it's discussed earlier than it would have been in the past. I think generally we try to analyze the business and then try to understand how the business, right, portfolio, culture, commercial partner capabilities fit into our organization. And I think in that assessment, right, there's, as I said before, for me there's two, in my oversimplistic perspective, there's two buckets, right? There's scale, right? Is there upside to a bigger operation? If we add more sales, if we can distribute in our commercial platform, what's the upside? What's the cost, right? And those are kind of easier to map out. I think the second bucket is complexity, right? And that's different because even with a significant operation supply chain team, we might not be able to overcome those challenges. And we're always trying to simplify, right? So adding complexity at a time where most likely that technology, that product doesn't have hundreds of millions of revenue to justify the effort, that becomes a challenge. So for me, as I think about reviewing a deal, it's what is its scale, what is its complexity, and how can we minimize the second, and that's generally how I think about supply chain issues post COVID.
Yeah, and I think that from a deal perspective, so there's always a deals don't happen overnight, so and that needs to be reiterated. So it's not going to be like, oh shoot, supply chain issue, can't do it, but there is going to be a lot more thoughtfulness going into it, and how is it, and if it is a material impact, it's probably going to be more on the financial side. So the financials of the deal probably don't look as good today as they did a couple of years ago. I guess taking that a step further, it's if a company can't, and going back to a few themes already to mentioned earlier, is if that margin is just not good, if you're looking at a margin that is a fraction of what it was really hoped to be, that could be a reason not to do something. Or maybe even earlier upstream, as we look at prospective deals, 6, 12, 18 months from now, and if it looks like maybe that isn't quite as margin accretive to what we want to do, then it just looks a little less favorable. That being said, there are headwinds all around that everybody's margins are shifting too. So it's a little bit of a reset. The strategy isn't changing. I will say that maybe in terms of how the supply chain is viewed, something and I believe and Antonio touched on this, is if it's a very unsophisticated supply chain and may not be well positioned going forward, that could be a problem. Or maybe even just making sure that we do at Philips, we do have minority investments, and we make sure that we work with them to and think about that help them out and ensure that they're thinking about the issue. So that long before a M&A type process is embarked on, is that they're positioning themselves for success, and that can be the trade-offs of taking something, bringing something in-house. It could be whether we advise them it's a good idea to do that or not. So again, I hate going back to, it's a lot of little things, but there's a lot more precision on it. And so it comes back to, at the end of the day, preparation. And as long as that there is a good solution and it matches with a company's strategy, acquirer strategy, it's not going to be a fatal event. It will just be a really inconvenient one for all involved, but it's not likely to blow anything up.
Mhm. Something that you mentioned in there is that the way that you're structuring the deals uh, is that you're saying that it may change the financials, but I was wondering, are there any other changes from a structural standpoint that you're seeing that are different with regards to the deals that are actually happening and going through nowadays?
Yeah, let me, I don't know that we're structuring anything differently. I think we're going about it the same way. I think the way that we would look at something, but I would say that maybe I'll tweak that a little bit. Thinking about one opportunity is that a frequent milestone is getting manufacturing established or making sure that scale. I think we'll maybe seeing that sales milestones are often in vogue in the field that I'm in, but we may see more manufacturing line establishment and looking at things like that to make sure that everybody's incentives are in line. I do think at the end of the day, though, I think it's going to be a lot about valuation. So if you've got, if the margins aren't going to be there, that or will be a little bit more challenged, that may be a swing factor in terms of how, or it may be an influential factor in how valuations start to get reset. But I think that process is going on already. Thanks to interest rate changes.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think that structure is being affected by this. I mean, the timeline might, and we might touch on that later, but I think, yeah, maybe, a higher component of the price goes into some sort of milestone payment based on sales or other sort of drivers, because there's more uncertainty, because, again, performance might be affected and you're trying to, assess why is that. But I think generally speaking, I don't see structure changing because of any of these issues.
Okay. That actually takes us to the exact next point, which is how are the supply chain and labor issues affecting timelines for mergers and acquisitions or other investment opportunities that you're seeing?
I don't think they're getting any shorter, right? I cannot think of any example where the timeline got shorter because of the current supply chain issues. I think, we've said a couple of times before, right? I mean, some of these supply chains are leading to, delays in regulatory clearance, and in a number of the areas I work and at work, that becomes a trigger for M&A, for the M&A opportunity to materialize. So I think, we're seeing timelines getting longer because, the regulatory clearance timeline is affected. I think it also, as I said before, it might affect, or it is affecting performance. So, and then it goes back to, what can we understand, explain, and risk assess, right, in that change of performance, or do we need to wait until the trend changes? And I think that can have a big impact from a timeline perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I don't think, to Antonio's point, nothing is moving quicker these days. Well, for a lot of things it's one component to everything. Many strategics have, you can look at their stock price facing some headwinds, and so there's a little bit extra scrutiny in a bear market from executives in terms of getting deals done. And so there's got to be, where this is so top of mind, not just from the deal team, but from the C-suite as well, is that you've got, this is just one component that adds to, have you thought this through? But there is some opportunity here as well, is that companies that do have established a very clear supply chain, have a good manufacturing system, which maybe it includes a strong contract manufacturer. There is a separation of the strong from the weak in times like this. So if you do the planning and you can't get through it all, that's going to be a real key distinguishing feature for companies, and it will resonate among the acquirers as well, is that this company, this may rise to the top versus its competitors because it has de-risked these items. And so while we've discussed a lot of the bad news here, and it is bad news, I want to reiterate, but there are going to be some winners in this, and and those that can do that will, and maybe it's not even acquisition. Maybe it's stating the obvious. Maybe it's getting that 6-month lead to market. Maybe it's getting 6 months extra sales. There are some things that can do that. But as far as the impact on the process, I've not encountered this, but if a company can figure that all out and has a very clear path, that probably would expedite. And maybe that is the next wave, something we see ahead in 2023.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some of the ways that people can, or I should say that companies can help to address and come up with solutions for some of the supply chain issues that you're seeing is to de-risk by getting, for example, strong contract manufacturers and getting their ducks in a row prior to approaching strategics. But what are some other types of solutions that you might see for people to try and de-risk these issues that they're seeing right now?
Yeah, it's been clear to me that bigger is better, and so any way you can build scale is probably the most immediate answer. So whether and I won't even try to say ideas there. I'm sure the audience has better ideas, but if there are partnerships that you can leverage to get better scale, that probably gets you a little further ahead in the queue. I think that's where the companies that I've dealt with on the early side have probably been at the biggest disadvantage. I think it's just being aware of how to plan ahead. There's obviously trying to find alternative sourcing, and I've heard some really interesting ideas, and I think that's going to probably be the best way going forward. I wish I had that magic wand, but it's just proper planning. And I think that the worst thing from the acquirer side is reiterating a point that we've said is when that type of planning hasn't been, when there's a lack of planning, or you're not factoring into your plans, that just shows real weakness. People are understanding to a degree that things are going to happen. They've happened to everybody, including the large companies. It's if you communicate one thing, hoping that you're going to pull a fast one, that's really like that would be a very no. I would just come clean, but I'd also be proactively trying to find a solution, and even just coming up with the solutions or ideas, showing that you're thinking about these things can mean a lot. And I do have to say, most people are doing just that. So it's really a testament to the creativity and ingenuity that exists in this industry.
So I was hoping for Jeff's magic wand. This is where I use my, I'm not a supply chain expert card, because I truly think it's really tough to come up with solutions, right? I think Jeff said it before. I mean, it's acknowledging it's challenging period. And I agree. I think bigger is better, and better is better, right? Meaning it's not time to trade off cost for a less robust supply chain. Again, it's way easier from an acquirer perspective to imagine what an optimized supply chain looks like and what the upside from a cost of goods is, versus having to figure out whether this can actually work. And so I think it's time to sort of play it safe from that perspective. I know that's not easy. I know that there's a gazillion trade-offs to make in that, with that perspective in mind, but unfortunately, I don't have any better solutions.
Yeah, another one that I'll just, maybe just a piece of advice more than anything that's indirectly is, especially for those that are dealing with contract manufacturers or thinking about dealing with contract manufacturers, it's understanding their relationships too. So not just the capabilities that they have, but are they dealing with the Medtronics, the Boston Scientifics, or do they have and understanding their types of just customer relations? Because if company A is doing a lot of business with the contract manufacturer and needs a certain component, going to guess that they have pretty good good ties there and getting that component or that something of that nature. And I do think the CMs are doing a pretty good job in managing that. But that's just, I'd say, for the really early companies that are saying, okay, who do I pick for a contract manufacturer? Just that it's not all of them are equal. Some of the small ones do great work. But if the goal is to try to get bigger and leverage the resources of a larger company without actually being one, the contract manufacturers can often help.
Excellent. So let's face it, oftentimes when people are doing their R&D, their design development, they're not always putting supply chain issues front of mind. And let's face it, if you can keep some of these issues in your mind when you're starting the product cycle, when you're developing your new products or you're doing your research and development, maybe you can address some of these issues before they even occur. So what sort of thoughts do you have from the investor and the strategic side that you would like, or that you would like to have seen when you're talking with potential targets?
Yeah, this one's a tricky one because you want the R&D and engineers to do what they do, is be creative and think about innovation. And so that you definitely want. On the other side of the equation, from a strategic acquirer side, you're very bottom line focused. And so we're not thinking about how can we do something, some turbo laser, super duper, whatever. However, I think where I've seen this issue come up in a number of instances is in Gen 2 development, where, hey, we have Gen 1, we're working on Gen 2, whereas maybe it started out as a concept of trying to make the next innovative. We're going to add the turbo laser, whatever you want to call. Now you're adding a lot of cost to it at a time, potentially adding costs, at a time when maybe cost redesign is actually where those resources are better spent, and in managing the supply chain that way. So you don't want to have a double cost escalator because components are going up and now you're adding more intricate components to it. You may actually just be trying to cost engineer to keep it status quo versus anything. So that's the fine line, is when you're a large company trying to think about managing the bottom line, but you don't ever really want to say to the engineers out there and they stop innovating. Like, you just like that you don't want to do that. So I think maybe it's just a good awareness of maybe it's a time and thinking about that, or just, and companies know how to manage that sequence better than I do, but that's just something I'd say watch out for. I've seen that a few times.
Yeah, I think not much to add to Jeff's point. I think it's being, and you sort of said it, John, is being thoughtful about it, right? And I'm not suggesting that we're not, but I think it's particularly relevant these days, and particularly that trade-off between performance and supply chain, right? I mean, what other, materials can you use that have a better supply chain perspective, right? I mean, I think these are all questions that will get asked at some point during diligence, and it's really helpful when the team is being thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I guess just one last point, because it's one of those that work in this industry know how the dynamics, but in contrast to even say like automotive or a number of industries where you can come up with a next gen product and pass along some cost, there is a point where in this field where it just can't get sold. So I think that just adds an extra hurdle to make sure that everybody is an acknowledgement of before going too far down that path and adding more cost.
Okay. So I know that we've touched on this a couple of times already, just in answers to other questions, but given the field that we're in and the importance for the field that we're discussing here today, I wanted to make sure that we ask this question by itself. Specifically, how do the current supply chain issues affect regulatory submissions and approvals? And what are the real concerns when you're coming in from the strategic and investor side when you see some of those issues impacting the regulatory approvals?
So I think,
sorry, Jeff.
yeah, so I think the regulatory approvals are still going on, but it is that time to getting there that is being impacted, and that can be a whole sequence of cascading issues. Sorry, Antonio.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think there's delays, right? And the, the how it affects specifically, I mean, I think I mentioned it before. I mean, it might be less samples, it might be less patients, right? And so that affects your ability to get ready for that regulatory submission. So the question again from a strategic perspective is, how do you differentiate the lack of interest versus the challenge to get enough patients in the room over a period of time so you can get to the samples that you need to submit your. So I think that's, that's kind of the challenges that I see and that I've seen for the past, since the beginning of COVID, right? When suddenly everything changed and recruiting patients for certain trials was no longer possible, and how I think companies have had that in a fascinating way, and a whole industry has thriven, right, in getting that, getting patients, recruited. But certainly that has affected timelines for submissions and approvals.
Yeah, I would say that even in a timelines are big here, and I think that the just something to be mindful of is for companies planning out is that a few months delay getting approval may mean a few months delay getting into the clinic, which may make them put them further in queue in terms of getting patients enrolled or getting investigators on board, and all these little things that add up. So again, just gets that back to planning. If you're not planning your business accordingly, and it may come back to haunt you. But I think that by and large, been impressed by how companies are able to adapt on the fly, and but that should never be a plan either. Is that we'll figure it out when we get there. I think the companies that can figure it out in advance and do a what happens if will be the ones that will make it through and be best positioned for the future.
Okay. So I know we've had a lot of questions here where we're focusing on the targets and the small companies, but here's a question that's more focused on the acquirers, the investors. Specifically, how are the supply chain issues affecting the ability of strategics to actually scale up production and provide improved margins and reduce costs post-acquisition?
Yeah, I think this is there's no easy solution from the large companies. There may be things where bringing it in over time can get into bulk purchase ordering, and especially on the component side, dealing with some of the subcomponent assemblies. There's some leverage there, but if you're going into existing manufacturing line or existing operations, or even dealing with a contract manufacturer, that there may not be any immediate answers. So an acquirer will be dealing with the bill of materials as is on day one, and if that's in difficult shape, it could take some time. And I guess it gets back to if you're dealing with very specialized components that only where there is no value to be added by the large acquirer, then it may not be. So kind of thinking about those things in advance. I think that from our side is that it certainly doesn't make I hate keep coming back to this point too, but it doesn't make the financial returns look any better. Whereas that may have been again, another theme here is that really wasn't discussed 2 to 3 years ago, or it just now it's okay. How are we thinking about the how this progresses over the next 12 to 24 months? and putting a little bit more of a finer comb to it. And when you do that, you still go through the exercise, you get through it, it is what it is, but and people can accept that. So yeah, it gets back to planning.
Yeah, I think that I don't think it's changed much except to be more conservative, right? I think the current supply chain environment is, the industry is behaving, it's taking one step at a time, right? In a post-acquisition environment, when they're thinking about integration, yes, there might be improved margin opportunities, but securing supply, it's top of mind because of everything else that's going. So definitely, I think we're more conservative, but thinking through the integration phase. I haven't seen anything else changing from that perspective.
Yeah. So given that entire supply chains throughout the industry have record backlogged orders, how is this impacting business development and the investment pipeline that investors and OEMs are seeing, not just today, but looking forward into the future?
I don't think these issues are materially impacting the pipeline and what we're looking at. I think it's another point of discussion impacting some financials, maybe even some timeline planning as to what is an investment's path forward over the next 24, 36 months. So I think that there's acknowledgement there. I do think that there are headwinds right now in the industry toward investment. As I stated, some companies facing some business headwinds, interest rates, stock valuations. There's a lot of macro factors that play that are impacting decisions at the C-suite level. But I don't see supply chain ruling things out or limiting the pool, other than the companies that just aren't emerging at all, which I guess there could be a few of those out there. But I think that good innovators, good companies, good products, good leaders are able to navigate, and those are usually the ones that rise to the top. Anyways, just maybe taking a different path to the exit and putting different skills at play.
Yeah, I agree 100% with sort of the headwinds coming. I think most large strategics are already looking into the future. And the question is it a soft landing? Is it a hard landing? I mean, I think that those headwinds are obvious in, with different metrics. And so I think we're all getting ready. But I think at the same time, that's not changing the growth aspirations of most strategics, right? I mean, we just announced last Monday, we've just acquired a $2.6 billion diagnostic asset, and we're going to continue to grow. And that doesn't change our pipeline or how we see sort of the business development priorities. I think that there's a little bit of an irony, though, and probably earlier in the sort of COVID phase, and it's that there were companies, and I remember a few examples, that because they have a significant amount of back orders, right, they wanted to continue to leverage on their existing commercial footprint, and the fact that if you suddenly, just give you a random example, if you 20% of your portfolio is not available because it's in back order, right, it means that you have a commercial platform that is not selling that, and what else can they sell? So I've seen companies that the backlog in their existing portfolio has led to a higher priority for business development, for filling that pipeline in a more in a fast pace. Now, whether that's possible or not, there's some challenges there, and I don't think it ultimately changes what they were looking for. But I think that it does bring back to the table that at a time where organic growth might be challenged by supply chain, inorganic growth is another powerful lever that companies like that are using.
Excellent. So I know that there's been a very large focus on the causes and impacts of the current supply chain crunch, but let's face it, those aren't the only supply chain issues that people should be aware of. And what are other supply chain issues that maybe they're a bit more what people think of as the typical supply chain issues that we thought of before COVID that you think that companies should still keep in sight?
Yeah, I can name a couple, and there's probably a lot more than this. And again, throwing out our collective disclosure, we're not supply chain experts. One is geographics/climate, hurricanes, and at my last company, very large and a lot of companies actually had manufacturing operations in Puerto Rico, and that created a lot of havoc. So there's still going to be those types of natural disasters out there that will disrupt. I think companies have learned a lot in trying to diversify and manage away from that, but there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be hurricanes, and just making sure that fires, things like that do exist. So not to forget about the oldies but goodies, but they're out there. I think the other one too, which may be more relevant to some of this audience, is there has been a lot of consolidation in the contract manufacturing field. I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure people listening to this know more than me on it, but just understanding that you're dealing with that companies continue to evolve in terms of their capabilities. So that is mostly a good thing. It can be a bad thing when ownership starts to change, management starts to change. Where are things being done? And so it's just being on top of things and understanding the history of the companies. There's a lot of great family-owned companies, but there are a lot of great large companies as well. But just making sure that you're dealing with a company that suits your needs and is attuned to your needs as well. That you may not just be an invoice, that you know how you're going to be able to manage a difficult situation with your partner.
Yeah, I think I echo Jeff's initial point that these challenges on the supply front are in addition to the old challenges, right? So those are still, here to stay, and so I think it's important not to. And this is all in addition to. So not to forget about those that most companies are already very good about planning for and preparing for. So.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we had specifically pre-prepared for the panel. So there's at least one question from the audience that I see in the chat that I wanted to read here. And if you have any other questions that you'd like to have the panel answer, feel free to type them in the chat, or I don't know if Nicole, if people are able to simply raise their hands and ask a question live, but we'll at least start with this one. So if a supply chain of the company being acquired is redundant with your current list of approved suppliers, is this a pro or a con, or not something that matters at all?
Yeah, I can't see how it would be a con. I think that the more redundancy, redundancy is often a bad word. This is where it's probably good. If you're using similar components, similar suppliers, guarantee at the large companies for certain suppliers, there's a relationship there, and that can be leveraged even further. I think when you're dealing with contract manufacturers, that's often a subtle but important one. If you're looking to acquire or if you're looking to exit, making sure that the contract manufacturer is approved by an acquirer. That if not that ties into some more quality issues. But I can't. I'm sure there is a reason why it would be a bad thing. It doesn't come to mind though.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jeff. I don't see how that would be a challenge. I mean, I think my supply chain operations colleagues might have a perspective onto whether down the road they would prefer to change and upgrade those, and or sometimes we might learn about new suppliers that honestly we're mindful of. But I can't imagine why that would be a bad thing.
Okay, well, I don't see any. Oh, we just got another question. Is there a certain type of innovation that you are bullish on?
How many hours do we have for that question? It's hard to summarize. I mean, I guess that it depends what space within medtech and healthcare you're looking at. But I think anything that in my perspective that improves outcomes, decreases costs, improves the experience both for the patient, for the physician, for the healthcare professional, I think those are always going to be relevant, and those will eventually be able to be monetized and bring value forward. So
yeah, was basically what I was going to say. I think I'll give credit. I've not met him, but there's a professor at MIT, Zen Shu, and he talks about like a triple lane of thinking about innovation is can you lower the cost, can you treat more patients, or can you expand access? And I know I messed that up a little bit, but I would say that I find some of his learnings his teachings pretty interesting. So just think about what you're doing. It's not just simply about engineering something, but things that can really do that and change healthcare accordingly.
So I'm not seeing any other specific questions that people want to have answered here. So are there any sort of closing statements regarding the overall topic that we're discussing here today that you just want to reemphasize with people?
I would just say again, I think it came out a couple times in the discussion. This is now a thing, right? I mean, I think it's something we're going to want to talk about in the context of M&A and partnerships, not just M&A. And having been thoughtful about it, having thought through it, it's relevant, and we look forward to engaging. And we will always bring our colleagues, right, that they can help in the discussion. But it does make a difference when the company is open and thoughtful about supply chain issues.
Yeah, and I'll add, this is a problem, but everybody involved here, if you're on the acquirer side, you're not looking to penalize people. Oh, that's too bad. You have a problem. Goodbye. It's usually a dialogue to how do we find a workable solution here? So I would really, it's a very subtle but a very important point. It just speaks to having good dialogue and talk with everybody. Again, it's what I heard at the end of the last session is there are good ideas out there. Find out, being able to use other people's ideas, understand that so many of people are going through the similar situation, and being able to and take advantage of that. So there are some positives here, and being able to plan accordingly can certainly help you.
Well, in that case, thank you both very much for your time here today. And if there are no other questions from the audience, I guess we're at least finished with this particular panel.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for leading a great conversation. Thank you, Antonio and Jeff, for your time and your expertise. I think you gave us a lot to think about. Unfortunately, no hot stock tips, but we'll let that go. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your time. And thank you again to our sponsors, FTI Consulting, Capaccio Environmental Engineering, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. This program was recorded today, so everyone who registered will receive a copy after the event. And you can go to massmedic.com and find the white paper that we talked about in the first session that was done by FTI Consulting, the State of Supply Chain Challenges, where they interviewed a number of different industry operations leaders. And you can download that from our website. While you're there, make sure you check out our upcoming events calendar and consider us in the future as one of your distribution channels and part of your marketing mix. We love to do programs like this, and it's only because of sponsors from our membership that we can do these for our members. So thank you very much and have a great day.